Hello and welcome to 6 Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series, What If Deku Gained the Power of Miles Morales. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
The little boy, just beginning to come to, had no idea where he was, but it was definitely not in his bed at home. He was pretty sure, in fact, that he was not lying in a bed at all. His sleep-deprived mind wondered whether he had been tucked inside a big, filthy sack of some kind, and if so, for what purpose. He found himself snug in a fetal position and cautiously tried to push out against the tough, yet flexible, slimy fabric that he felt was enveloping him, and by whom? As it was, all he could think about was wanting to get out of this situation. He was vaguely aware that if he had been more awake, he probably would have completely panicked at his predicament. The boy first took a moment to determine which way was actually up or down by using his sense of gravity. Then he began to scratch and claw into the tough fabric that was covering him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it felt like some kind of flexible shell or membrane. Eventually, he was able to pierce his fingers all the way through to the other side, which gave him a handhold as he stretched his arms apart and gradually tore open a large rift in front of himself. As he slowly tunneled his way out of the numerous bags, and to freedom, he discovered that he had been wrapped in not one, but several thick layers. Fortunately, these layers were much softer and more pliable than the first set had been, making them much easier to tear upon or just brush aside. He instinctively pulled his arms back to protect his face as he finally broke through the final layer, the sudden light hitting his eyes. Gravity assisted him in taking the last step from inside to outside as he slipped through the opening and fell 3 or so feet before landing unceremoniously face first with a bang on the floor because he was no longer bracing himself against the surrounding fabrics. The boy was balancing upside down on his face for a few long seconds before finally toppling over and landing flat on his back. He writhed on the floor, coughing and moaning from the two impacts. As he tried to adjust to the bright, clinical lighting that poured down from the tall ceiling, he decided that his face hurt the most and used one hand to carefully nurse his nose while the other protected his eyes. The first thing he noticed as his eyes began to adjust was that his field of vision appeared slightly different than usual, as though he could see a wider view of his surroundings than would be strictly normal. The first was that the bag he had forced himself out of wasn't actually a bag. From his position on the floor beneath it, it was difficult to tell, but it appeared more like a white cocoon of some kind, suspended in midair by a multitude of thick, sticky-looking strings that stretched and crisscrossed everywhere like a gigantic spiderweb. Spider. The mere mention of that word swiftly dispelled his haze and bewilderment in favor of alarm, and he instantly jolted to his feet, sitting with wide, bloodshot eyes. However, he froze when he noticed that a line of figures was now standing a short distance away, encircling the boy in a loose half-circle. They were all wearing helmets and armored gear over a uniform that looked almost military, and they were all watching him intently, as though they were waiting for him to do something. They weren't armed in the traditional sense, but they were all showing indications that they had unique quirks, and they seemed prepared to use them at any time if they so desired. As he retreated cautiously against the webbing wall behind him, the boy said, "What's going on?" As he struggled to pronounce the words correctly, he exclaimed, "Who are you people? Where am I?" His mouth felt slack and rigid, as if it hadn't been used correctly in a long time. The majority of the soldiers, who appeared to be watching him closely, exchanged glances behind their dark visors and appeared to ease back a bit when they saw him retreat rather than advance. The boy became aware that he, the web cocoon, and the soldiers were all inside this spacious, square, and clinical-looking room when he looked more closely. A single steel gate on the far wall behind the soldiers appeared to be the only way out of the smooth, fortified walls. He cocked his head to the side to look past them and saw that the same wall also had a large window panel where a number of people in long white coats appeared to be furious as they watched him from outside the room. What-ish this place?" the boy exclaimed uneasily as he attempted to soothe his parched throat. "Habe. Have I been kidnapped by some shady government organization to be XXX experimented on or something? Ho. Calm down, young lad, there's no reason to fret." As the boy looked straight ahead, he saw a small, wrinkled grandmother, dressed in a lab coat with a visor over her eyes, push past the soldier's legs and approach him. Despite her advanced age, the girl's presence made the boy acutely conscious of the fact that he was currently only dressed in ripped and torn rags, which, to be honest, did little to conceal his body. At the very least, the grandmother added, leaning on her cane to steady herself while silently observing him, "You're probably only partially correct." "Here," she said, presenting a tiny dispenser. Do you want some candy? Don't be shy now. Another man in a lab coat had come into the room and was sprinting in their direction while the shocked boy was still trying to comprehend what had happened. The newcomer called out to the small elderly woman, Dr. Shuazenji, as the soldiers allowed him to pass. You mustn't just barge into the observation room before we've ascertained the subject's threat level. He might be dangerous, ow. The little old woman harumphed, pulling her cane away from the man's shin and then turning back to face the boy on the floor. Most people could be dangerous in today's society if they so chose to be, she said. And I can tell just from looking that this one doesn't mean to cause anyone any harm. Do you, boy? Huh? And no, I don't, at least I don't think so. The elderly woman's grandmotherly smile slightly expanded at that response, and she gave a nod of approval. Yes, that's good to hear, indeed. Now, lad, I'm certain you have plenty of questions to ask. But before we get started, can you please tell me your name? My name. Yes. Surely you know what your own name is, don't you, lad? The boy spluttered, Of course I do, as though saying otherwise would be absurd. It's Izuku. Midoriya Izuku. The middle-aged, pleasantly plump woman, Midoriya Inko, was hurrying down the corridors as quickly as she could, her breathing ragged. In a more secure and fortified section of the city's main hospital, she had almost left the nurse leading her in her wake as she hurried through the hallways with the familiarity of someone who had been there enough times to know the layout by heart. She finally stopped in front of a door where two armored guards were keeping watch. The nurse struggled to steady her breathing and braced her hands on her knees. Eventually, she caught up and panted an explanation to the two guards, who nodded quickly and moved aside to let the two women in as they opened the door. A sophisticated hospital room with screens and equipment for various medical examinations was behind the door. However, of the few people present, the middle-aged woman's focus was fixed on the young, bushy-haired boy wearing hospital pajamas who was sitting on one of the benches while a small elderly doctor lady used a stethoscope to listen to his vital signs. But as soon as she had walked into the room, his eyes had turned to look at her, just as hers had locked onto him. For a few seconds, the two looked at each other in stunned silence before the boy appeared to be the first to break the spell. Mom. Is Izuku. The middle-aged woman was sobbing uncontrollably as she rushed forward, while the bushy-haired boy was ecstatic. The boy pushed himself off the bench and stumbled unsteadily across the floor, ignoring the old doctor's protests, before falling forward into his mother's eager embrace. Izuku. The woman cried as she clung to him for dear life, still crying. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. When it first happened, I was so worried. You were just so hurt, and the doctors, they couldn't help you. And then you spent all those months in that cocoon thing, and The boy softly returned the hug and put his head between her neck and shoulder, savoring the comforting smell and embrace of his mother. I've missed you too, Mom, he said. When the woman's sobbing had finally subsided to a more tolerable level, she let go of him and stood back, holding his face in her hands to get a good look at him. The boy in front of her was definitely her son, but he had changed a little in appearance since she had last seen him. In addition to having longer, messier hair that obscured almost half of his face, the boy had also grown a few inches taller, which made it necessary for him to slouch forward significantly so she could properly embrace him earlier. Additionally, she could see from his open hospital shirt and slightly sharper jawline that he had become much more ganglier and appeared somewhat malnourished, which wasn't shocking considering the situation. The teary-eyed woman pulled him forward and planted a large kiss on his cheek, her motherly smile frazzled but real. She inhaled sharply. It's so good to see you again, Izuku. He returned the smile, the shy, weary one he had been wearing since they had embraced. Yeah. It's nice to see you too, Mom, he said. Is you body alright? How are you feeling? You're not hurting anywhere, are you? Softly, I feel fine, Mom, was the response. I mean, my body feels weak, and tired. Like I'm completely exhausted. But other than that, I feel fine, Mom. I feel fine. Inko sighed and used her sleeve to wipe away her tears. Oh, thank goodness. Not daring to finish that sentence, she trailed off. Back when it first happened, I was so worried that you wouldn't. Oh, let me get all this hair of yours out of the way. Mom. Wait. Izuku tried to reach up a hand to stop her as she reached up to brush away the long, frazzled locks, but it was too late, and he saw his mother freeze when she had a clear view of his features. The woman remarked in the back of her mind that although the wide-eyed, freckled face staring back at her was her son's, he was doing so with a few more sets of eyes than she was accustomed to. A number of small dark orbs, gleaming with the same green tint that adorned his normal sets of eyes, were scattered across the boy's forehead and appeared to be focusing back upon her. Features like these were not at all grotesque or strange to see in their contemporary society, where people with supernatural abilities or features were actually more common than the opposite. But Inko was surprised to see something like that on her son's face, which for over 13 years had appeared as normal and unremarkable as a quirkless human's face could possibly be. After a while, her mind reset itself, and she forced herself to look past the tiny eyes on his forehead to his general, tentatively worried expression. Are you all right, Mom? She gave him another quick hug just to be safe. I'm sorry, honey. I was just surprised, that's all, she reassured him. I was kind of surprised myself when I found out about them, he said, chuckling softly. It's okay, Mom. While this was true, it was also a gross understatement because the old doctor had a cheerful expression on her face as she held up a handheld mirror for the jittery boy, who had almost screamed in surprise. Inko went on, Those extra eyes of yours, are they a result of what happened to you? Has your body changed in any other ways as well? That was what we've been trying to catalog ever since the boy emerged earlier this morning, the little old lady mentioned above said, after silently letting the mother and son enjoy their reunion without any interruptions. Emerged, Inko said cautiously as she turned to face her. You mean from that large cocoon thing? Indeed, said the elderly physician. Once we ascertained that young Izuku here, despite his physical fatigue, was more or less in sound mind and health, we've been busy examining all the ways his body has mutated while inside the cocoon. The changes are multiple, but so far it's safe to say that they all share a similar characteristic. Inko swallowed. She could see the direction of this. Let me guess. They're spider-like? Very much so, the physician said, nodding again. Well, that's... Inko blinked as her eyes darted around indecisively before landing on her son's face, who smiled at her with wide eyes. He nervously scratched his cheek and reassured her, It's all right, Mom, I was honestly pretty shocked at first, but now I'm actually feeling a little excited at the prospect. Then isn't this great, Izuku? She asked, her optimism cautious but growing. Despite the circumstances, you've finally gotten a quirk of your own. That means you might one day be able to become a hero, just like you've always wanted. He answered, I know, right? As they both smiled in tiny but sincere ways. The male scientist, doctor from earlier interrupted, saying, And now hold on just a moment, we can't just release a boy with a highly unorthodox mutation out into the general public. The boy must be quarantined until we've properly tested and analyzed the risk of OW. She pulled her cane away from the now crouching man's shin again and said, What my colleague who's severely lacking in bedside manner is trying to get across, is that we'd like some time to study his unusual condition in a controlled environment for a while just until we can determine both the full scope of his new abilities, as well as help him control them so that he won't accidentally pose a risk to anyone, particularly himself. After exchanging looks with her son, Inko said, I guess that is reasonable. He nodded confidently and affirmatively. Just as long as you can assure me that I'll be allowed to visit my little boy regularly, that is. But of course, the elderly woman said with a reassuring smile. To be frank, I already have some ideas about how to proceed with this matter that I'd like to discuss with the two of you. We're just waiting for someone else to arrive, and then we can get started. Inko blinked and asked, Someone else? Who would that be? Izuku had an instinctive feeling that told him to turn toward the door as soon as his mother had finally finished speaking. He'd honestly never experienced anything like it before, so he assumed it was instinctive. At any rate, the tall, muscular, larger-than-life figure posing in the doorway as he made his dramatic entry caused the door to slam open the next second with enough force to almost embed itself in the wall. For dramatic effect, his brilliant white smile pinged once. Never fear, good people. Why, you ask? He said. Because I am here. Dr. Shuazenji took a sip of her tea and said, Now for starters. The mutation of the boy's body has among other things greatly enhanced his general physiology, all the way down to his very skeleton and connective tissues. Quirk augmentations like these are known to grant the individual in question increased levels of strength and durability, as something which the preliminary tests we've done so far seems to support in regards to young Izuku here. The four figures sitting on the tiny office couch across from her listened intently to every word as the little old doctor spoke. However, some of them more than others, which makes sense. From the right edge of the tiny couch, Midoriya Inko said, So in short, you're saying that my son will have super strength? As she watched her son sitting next to her. Exactly how strong exactly are we talking here? The doctor said, that is a little hard to determine until his body has fully rehabilitated, setting down her cup to quickly look over a few medical records. But if I were to hazard a guess, based on these readings, I figure he should be able to lift or press a couple of tons at the very least. TT tons. The bug-eyed mother and son pair cried aloud, their shocked faces identically comical. Taking their loud incredulity completely in stride, the doctor pondered aloud, perhaps eventually up into the double digits, with the proper training. She jotted down some brief notes on the papers with a pen, then went on calmly. Well, it's nothing near the level of heroes like All Might for instance, but it will certainly rank the boy's base strength firmly in the superhuman category. The enormous, muscular figure grinned as he sat on Izuku's left, occupying the majority of the tiny couch's seating area with his massive frame. Oh ho! That is some strength, indeed, he said. When he said, a person can do a lot of good with that kind of strength, he nodded congenially. Especially should they so choose to become a hero. Since the legendary hero was standing right next to them, the two Midoriya family members were already on the verge of becoming overly excited, anxious wrecks, so their only response to the man's praise was an awkward smile. Despite his constant smile, the hero turned slightly more serious and added, however, that's not all there is to his new quirk, is there, Doctor? No, that's just barely scratching the surface. Little Izuku's quirk, though unorthodox, can be classified as a mutant-type quirk. More specifically, an animal-based mutation, in this case that of a spider. Mother and son gulped loudly and turned to face the future. The little old granny said, as you can see on these magnified scans, passing out a small stack of pictures, his body has gained several additional features designed to allow him to simulate a spider's natural abilities. For example, the microscopic hairs on the insides of his hands and feet now resemble the scopulae hairs on the ends of a spider's leg, which is what allows them to statically cling to surfaces at an atomic level. That, along with his increased physical strength, should allow him to climb up vertical surfaces with ease, at least once he learns to control their adhesion. She smiled amusedly as the boy shook his hand back and forth, struggling to release the picture he was holding on his palm like it was glued to it. He gradually succeeded in prying it free without tearing it by pulling with his free hand, only to sigh in frustration when he realized it was now stuck to that hand. A large hand carefully grasped his forearm while another grabbed at the edge of the picture, which remained firmly attached despite his renewed efforts. All Might helped him release the photo and set it on the low coffee table in front of them. Here, allow me, he said. Izuku said, thank you, with timidity. Don't worry about it, youngster, All Might said with a smile and a nod down at the nervous boy. However, the hero appeared to raise an eyebrow in confusion when the child turned away from him, his freckled face sporting a somewhat dejected, if not guilty, expression. On the opposite side of the couch, Inko steadily shifted her gaze from the photos she had been examining to her son's wrists. She eventually grabbed one of Izuku's arms and held it up with the matching CT scan of it, saying, then, Doctor, what are these things inside Izuku's wrists and forearms here? She was referring to internal tubes that ran down to the strange little protrusions on the inside of his wrists. That would be his spinnerets. His what? She answered, blinking. The doctor said, here. Allow me to demonstrate, as she scooted out of her tall chair and circled the coffee table. Now, hold out your arm, boy. Izuku said, okay. Sure, and followed directions, letting the elderly woman explore his forearm and grab hold of it. She said, what you're seeing on the CT scans would be the tubes from his silk glands, running down the length of his arms until exiting here upon the wrists via his spinnerets. Now, if I were to apply a little pressure in the right places, she said, and she did, causing something to explode out of the boy's wrist with a whip, and embed itself against the wall across the room. Bingo! The boy becomes able to launch his very own webbing. All Might put a hand on the boy's jaw and nodded in fascination at the demonstration, while Inko just blinked in confusion as the thin white string of sticky fluid, which extended from the boy's wrist to the wall, dangled across the room. But Izuku's brain was having a hard time processing this new bodily function, so he could only gape openly. I can't. Oh, pull yourself together now, lad, the doctor said in a motherly voice as she leaned up and used her hand to cover his mouth before turning to return to her chair. I'd say you were quite fortunate with this particular mutation. Just imagine. You could have ended up shooting your webbing out of your butt, the way actual spiders do. The boy was immediately jolted out of his daze by that realization. He didn't want to think too much about what that might have looked like. The little old granny climbed back up into her chair and helped herself to another sip of her tea while he used his other hand to help him remove the line of webbing from his wrist. Now then. Including his additional sets of eyes, these are perhaps the most obvious mutations to little Izuku's body. At the moment they are in their teething stages, but as his health recovers, their potential should increase exponentially. And this is where one of our concerns lies. Izuku and his mother looked up at her, and Izuku said, What do you mean? But the man next to them responded. As I'm sure you are aware, a person's quirk normally manifests itself at the age of 4. It thereon proceeds to grow and develop little by little over time as the user themselves ages, allowing their mastery of it to become nothing short of second nature by the time they've grown up. However, in young Midoriya-kun's case, who is already 14, his quirk has and will continue to develop at an accelerated pace, something that will likely affect his control over it. Without careful guidance, the result of that could easily become quite unfortunate. The professional hero coughed into his hand and looked away as he noticed that the two members of the Midoriya family were looking up at him with awe and fear. During my long career, I've seen for myself how unorthodox quirks might overwhelm or harm their own users. While young Midoriya's circumstances are indeed out of the ordinary, there have been a handful of other cases with factors that are comparable. Izuku muttered, I see, and then glanced down at his slowly clenching and unclenching fists as his mother gave him a worried look. At last, the fourth person on the couch said, which brings us to why All Might-kun and myself are here in the first place, in a high-pitched, squeaky voice. On the opposite side of All Might, seated at the left edge of the couch, was a small, white-furred creature wearing a suit and tie, with a scar across its right eye. Even though the Midoriyas had already been shocked by the legendary All Might's arrival at the hospital earlier, they had been even more shocked and perplexed by the diminutive but talkative creature that immediately emerged from his shirt collar. Nedzu was a well-dressed creature that now sat next to them. It looked like a cross between a mouse, a dog, and a small bear, and it held the respectable position of principal of UA, the best high school for heroes' academy. There have been cases before, where a person have come out of a coma for instance and discovered afterwards that their quirk has grown beyond their control in the interim, he continued. In situations like these, the best thing to do is to keep the individual in question in an isolated environment while carefully selected professionals help them familiarize and adapt to their new circumstances, until they've become fully prepared to return to society once more. Think of it like physiotherapy for a patient to master their quirks until they no longer run the risk of harming anyone accidentally with it at least, said Dr. Shuazenji. Leaning forward to see the small principal beyond the large hero seated between them, Inko asked unsurely, and where exactly would this therapy take place? It won't be somewhere far away and remote, will it? Concerned about the possibility as well, Izuku cast a worried glance down at his feet. Nedzu said, in some cases, yes, and Inko's heart sank. But in this instance, I would like to extend an offer of handling his therapy locally, on the UA grounds. Before their eyes started to bug out, the mother and son uttered the word in unison, E. They both let out startled screams and then fell into a gibbering mess together. Oh, on UA? The UA? Why you're going to treat him on the grounds of that famous school? E. As the two continued to scream, the small elderly doctor murmured, HMPH. So noisy. And reached up under her headdress to rub her ear. She commanded, now calm down, already. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for this decision. All Might couldn't help but blink and perspire at the sudden change in demeanor as the two sat down properly again to sit at attention. She removed her headgear and began wiping the visor with a tissue. As you might know, my full-time position is as the school nurse chiefly responsible for treating the students who are training to become heroes at the academy, she informed them. But since I've been so closely involved with Midoriya's case so far, this would allow me to continue monitoring him as his quirk develops while also looking after my regular job. The principal took over, and the two gave a dumb nod before turning to their left. Also, on UA we have several professional heroes and experienced teachers at hand whom would be perfectly suited to handle young Midoriya's physical therapy, while simultaneously overlooking his health and safety, he said. While he will probably be kept separate from the students until further notice, it should at least provide a well-suited and nurturing environment for his rehabilitation. The Midoriyas realized they were very lucky to have this little old woman on their side when the elderly doctor muttered, at least more than being kept locked inside a sealed facility somewhere, with a hint of bitterness in her voice. Naturally, the teachers can be counted on to help him catch up with his school studies as well, Nedzu assured the two, leaning forward. Inko put a palm to her forehead and confessed, I don't know what to say. This seems almost all too good to be true. Yeah, Izuku said slowly as he nodded, his face displaying a little more conflict than his mother's. All Might laughed and said, and who knows? He might even be able to apply for the Academy's proper entrance exam as early as next semester if his rehabilitation goes well enough. Ha ha glurk, he exclaimed as a cane suddenly flew up and struck him in the face. The elderly physician scolded him, "What do you think you're doing, you blasted fool," while she stood in her chair. The boy will have enough on his plate just focusing on his rehabilitation. He doesn't need you fanning the flames for something like that right out of the gate, you tremendous nincompoop. I'm sorry, All Might said, returning the woman's walking stick while nursing his nose. I guess I got a little carried away there. There's nothing, little, about it, honestly. You need to learn better restraint, All Might-kun. Nedzu smiled and gave a gentle reprimand. I have no excuse. Inko turned to her son, who was leaning forward in his seat, and placed her hands on his shoulders after she had blinked uncontrollably at the sight of the legendary #1 hero hanging his head in shame while being lectured like a child. She gave him a slight shake and said, Isn't this amazing, Izuku? This is like everything you've ever dreamed of. Izuku? The rest of the room turned to the boy sitting hunched forward with his head hanging down, his face obscured by his frazzled hair, who appeared unresponsive to the world around him, at the woman's unsure voice. The woman tried, Izuku, once more, shaking him a little more forcefully, which seemed to startle him out of it. He gave her a friendly, wah, oh yeah, it is, Mom, before lowering his gaze once more with a somewhat ambiguous expression. It truly is. Inko's brows furrowed at the boy's persistent lack of energy. Inquiringly, Izuku. What is it? After some time, he said quietly, Mom? Would you mind if I talked with everyone here by myself? For a moment? Inko had appeared worried and apprehensive, but she had finally consented to leave the room for a short while, being led outside by a nurse to get some coffee. After the door had clicked behind her, the boy sat in his hunched forward position while the other three figures in the room silently looked at him. The old doctor broke the tense silence by saying, Well, we're alone now. What's on your mind, lad? Actually. The kid mumbled, I think it might be best if I were to talk with All Might, all alone. The man said, Calm down, kid, and he dropped his enormous fist onto the boy's shoulder in a comforting manner. These two are old acquaintances of mine. Anything you'd like to tell me, you can say in front of them as well. Izuku stirred, but his head remained down. Finally, his voice became weak and raw as he spoke. Are you doing all of this, so I will keep my mouth shut? There was widespread blinking. Come again, boy? He spread his arms wide and said, all of this, before firmly putting them back on his legs. He gripped his knees tightly and gritted his teeth. This fantastic opportunity you're giving me here. Is it all because that I know the truth? He asked. Because that I know about your secret? When the people in the room finally understood what this was all about, their eyes widened. Izuku went on to babble, saying, because it's unnecessary, really. I mean, you're the symbol of peace. For crying out loud. I could never do something like reveal that to everyone, of course, that doesn't mean that I'm not happy about your offer. In fact, I'm ecstatic. It's just. While he was speaking, All Might had risen from his chair and knelt before the boy to lay his big hands on his shoulders. Nevertheless, the boy refused to look up and appeared to recoil at the touch. When All Might saw this, he sighed in a strange and drawn-out manner before tiny streams of steam began to emerge from his body and eventually burst into a cloud that made him invisible. Izuku was startled to see the gangly face of All Might's actual form when he looked up. Yagi Toshinori. As the two gazed at each other, Izuku's one visible eye between his disheveled mop of hair widened and he exhaled, All Might. Reassuring him, you've gotten it all wrong, Midoriya, my boy. Toshinori squeezed his now bony fingers tighter around the boy's shoulders. This thing here, it isn't an attempt at bribing you into silence about this true form of mine. No, that's not it at all. Toshinori looked down, shook his head slightly, and then looked back at Izuku. While our offers are indeed mostly genuine, he acknowledged, this is in part also about repaying you what I owe. As well as making amends for letting you down that day not only once, but twice in succession. Letting me down? Izuku asked, looking back as though he wasn't quite sure what he meant. That the concept itself was nearly absurd, but the expression in Toshinori's eyes was still entirely grave. From a strict perspective, the 14-year-old Midoriya Izuku's day had not gone as well as he had hoped. His idol, the renowned #1 hero All Might, was scheduled to make an appearance at a public event today, not far from his hometown. As it turns out, a bigwig had persuaded the hero to perform a hero show at a recently opened, brand new supermall in exchange for a sizable donation donated straight to charity. The only issue was that it was actually planned for a rather early afternoon on a school day, which meant that if Izuku had hoped to get to the correct city district before the event began, he would have had to exhaust himself getting to and from the train stations as soon as his classes ended. As a result, he was running for his life down the final few blocks toward the mall because he was eager to see the superhero in person for the first time and didn't want to miss a second of it. The amount of effort he was currently enduring also made him feel like dying, but he would persevere for the benefit of his idol. When the understandably popular topic was brought up in class earlier, it naturally sparked a conversation about the students' plans for the year after graduation. To everyone's surprise, everyone wanted to apply to UA, the world's top hero academy in high school for aspiring heroes. However, when it was revealed that he, the only quirkless student in the class, was aiming for UA, his dream of becoming a hero had also been ridiculed by his classmates, who had made him a laughingstock for the umpteenth time. However, things worsened. He had been cornered by the class bully and his cronies after the majority of the class had left for lunch. They had then made fun of his hero journal, the notebooks where he had recorded his observations about active heroes and quirks over the years. He was now up to number 13, and tried to destroy it out of pure, petty vengeance. Izuku had recovered and salvaged most of it later, but his mood had soured due to the casual cruelty of the bully's words and actions. He had spent the remainder of the day keeping his head down and trying his best not to look at anyone else. Nevertheless, he had been anticipating the events that would follow despite the day's disappointments. The boy had left the house as soon as the bell rang and hurried to the closest train station. He had to run a few blocks before and after the train ride, but he had made it. Now he was here, hands on his knees, breathing heavily, and perspiring profusely. At last, he had reached the super mall where the event was being held. Izuku entered and saw that, even though it was already past the hour, the venue was still crowded with people who were all looking forward to the performance. They were either lining up in front of the large stage that had been set up on the ground floor or crammed up against the banisters on the upper floors, all the way up to the 6th floor. Izuku couldn't help but smile as he looked around, at the people themselves, as well as the sheer number of people who had scheduled time to attend the event with their families or friends. Around him, he saw people with strange or unusual traits blending in with the general population, illustrating how the people of the modern era had changed and transformed into a superbeing society where almost everyone was accepted despite their odd looks or skills. And the man they had all come to see today was largely responsible for the stable peace their nation currently enjoys. Oh no, shoot. He had nearly forgotten that the show was about to begin because he had become so engrossed in attempting to deduce the possible quirks of some of the people in his immediate vicinity based on their physical mutations. He should move quickly to see if he can locate a suitable location to watch it for. Izuku stopped when he heard a familiar voice say, "Deku. I should have known a nerd like you would be here," from behind him. Izuku slowly turned around and saw the all-too-familiar arrogant grin of a boy with ash-blonde hair and spiky hair who was dressed in the same middle school uniform as him. This was none other than his childhood friend Bakugo Katsuki, who was considered by his peers to be a gifted genius and a sure bet for future hero material because of his quirk, which enabled him to produce explosions with the palm of his hands. Unfortunately, he also had a huge ego, a terrible temper, and was essentially Izuku's worst enemy because he was the one who started the majority of the bullying the boy had experienced since they were in kindergarten. HMPH. I thought you disappeared quickly once the bell rang, he sniffed smugly as he walked swaggering up to him. As several tiny explosions burst in one of his palms, he teasingly said, I assumed you were going home to cry your heart out over that dumb journal of yours. But I guess everything else takes a backseat for your geek on for heroes, huh? You must have ran your ass off to make it all the way here this quickly, didn't you, you fucking nerd? The shy Izuku turned to the other boy, his hands clenched tightly on the straps of his backpack, his face displaying a range of emotions. Fear of offending the boy once more. Hatred for constantly being subjected to the boy's haughty whims. And a sense of sorrow that their friendship had been diminished to this. Izuku, however, was distracted from his nerves as he began to pick up on small details in the other boy's appearance as they stared at one another. The details soon came together in the green-haired boy's mind, from the barely perceptible drops of sweat trickling down Katsuki's cheek to his somewhat labored breathing. He grinned amiably upon realizing, you hurried and ran all the way over here as well, didn't you, Kachan? You must have wanted to not miss anything of All Might's show either, huh? GHK. So what if I did? The other boy retorted, looking flustered and furiously at being readily exposed. "It's none of your frickin' business anyway, you fucking nerd." Despite the disapproving glances he received, the ash-blonde boy shoved his hands into his pockets and stomped past the other boy in a huff as he marched over to the crowd. He then used his sunny disposition to muscle and intimidate his way forward into the sea of people so he could get closer to the stage. Izuku tried to follow him into the crowd's wake, but he was stopped when the other boy spun around and held out an open palm to hover directly in front of his face. "Ah, Kachan. Wait up," Izuku called. Even though the people around them didn't see the threat, Izuku did, having spent years learning the ins and outs of Katsuki's quirk. He sneered darkly at him. "Haven't I told you to quit being such a fucking tagalong, Deku?" As particles of smoke and barely perceptible heat drifted off his outstretched hand. "Just settle for watching the show from far, far away on the back row. It's where a quirkless loser like you will have to spend the rest of your life after all." After making that mocking statement, Katsuki turned around and resumed pushing forward, leaving a dejected Izuku who could only stand and watch in silence as his form finally vanished into the crowd. Somewhere, a battered and bruised man was hunched over on the floor, sweating heavily, in a dimly lit room that was mostly lit by a large screen that displayed several feeds from the mall's surveillance system. With labored breathing, he moaned, I can't keep going," as though he were suffering from an invisible kind of chronic stress. "It's been too long. I can't continue maintaining it." From somewhere in the shadows, a cool, collected voice said, "Just a little while longer now, my friend," obviously indifferent to the other man's stress. "You've hanged in there this long. Everything should be in place in just a few more minutes." Please." The man cried into his eyes, "I can't." The voice said, We've been over this already," in a casual manner. "Just continue keeping your quirk activated as you're told. After all, you know what will happen if you don't." The speaker would undoubtedly carry out the underlying threat, as evidenced by the abrupt sharp edge in the otherwise serene and quiet voice. The kneeling man gritted his teeth and leaned his forehead against the floor, whimpering and moaning from the intense effort he was going through as he looked down at the crinkly photograph he was holding in his hand like a lifeline. The voice continued, there, just a little more," as its owner returned their focus to the wall-mounted screen. "All Might should be there any second now, and then it will all be over. Both for you, and for them." Everyone in the shopping center was excited to see the legendary hero up close, and they were swarming against the railings of the upper-story balcony floors that overlooked the main hall. However, Izuku leaned back against the store's display window and sighed wearily, a few feet behind some of the assembled spectators. He had made several attempts, but none of them offered enough room for anyone who arrived late to squeeze in and have a decent view of the stage below, either from the front or the sides. He couldn't help but feel a little bitter about his situation in life as he looked at the backs of the crowd that were obstructing his view. Some people had quirks that helped them see over the crowd, such as telescopic necks or eyeballs on antennas, but he had none of that, and he was rarely given a handicap to compensate for it, not in this or any other situation like it. Instead, all he ever received, usually from his old childhood friend, was mockery and contempt for his lack of authority. Even without a quirk, his dream of becoming a hero seemed a bit unrealistic, but so what? That doesn't imply that it was impossible at all, does it? It's possible that Kachan was correct all along and that his stubbornness was just a delusion. Izuku sighed again, letting his head fall sideways in a dejected way and banging it against the glass panel behind him. With his head leaning against the glass and thinking about things in this way, he finally recognized that the store he was standing outside of was actually the pet store in the mall. He could see numerous glass tanks and cages full of small fish and other creatures, such as rodents, rabbits, and the like, relaxing in the otherwise deserted store as he peered through the large display window. These creatures didn't necessarily require constant supervision in their containments. He also raised an eyebrow when he saw some glass cages with spiders of all sizes and breeds lining one of the walls. The boy suppressed a shudder when he saw one of the larger ones scuttling around inside its containment on its long, hairy legs. The boy didn't personally see the appeal of owning a pet like that, but there was undoubtedly a market for those things. Unfortunately, the pet store had another display window that ran perpendicular to the one he was leaning against because it was situated on the corner of a hallway that led back to the restrooms, emergency exits, and other amenities. He saw two people exiting one of the doorways leading to the back corridors, which were reserved for employees only, through these two sets of windows. However, based on his uniform, one of them appeared to be a member of the mall's security, while the other was a stunning woman with long, spiky hair that fell down her back, wearing a form-fitting, somewhat obscene superhero costume that looked like a dominatrix. Izuku immediately identified the woman as the professional hero, Kayama Nomori, or the notorious, 18 plus only, heroine, Midnight. Seeing a pro hero so close lifted Izuku's spirits, and he scurried from the window to the shop's corner to watch the two of them as they stood down the hallway, conversing. Amazing. It's really Midnight. He began fanboying in a low voice. I've gotta try and ask for her autograph. However, the boy was stopped in his tracks before he could try to move out into view and approach them because he suddenly registered the two of them talking. The man had shut the door behind them and asked, "So, is All Might going to be done preparing soon, Ms. Midnight?" As she adjusted the coiled-up whip hanging on her hip, the hero grinned and said, "No worries. He told me he only needed to freshen up a bit, and then he should be ready to appear on stage in about 5 minutes or so." The man nodded and they began to move through the hallways, avoiding the crowd by taking the longer route around the building. "I see, that's good," he said. "But I must say, with the turnout this event has caused, I'm incredibly relieved by the fact that even a pro hero like yourself was willing to lend an extra hand with the security. Well, my quirk is pretty well suited for crowd control, after all. Besides, no matter the unbelievable audacity it would require for a villain to try causing trouble at an event with All Might himself present, it doesn't hurt to be cautious, you know. I assure you that we've taken every precaution we could in preparation, but nevertheless, we're still well and truly grateful for your presence as well today." "My, you flatterer, you." Izuku sneaked into the hallway and up to the next corner behind them while they were conversing. A portion of their conversation replayed itself in his mind as he watched them go, looking back at the door they had first left. Somewhere in the back rooms, All Might was preparing. The boy couldn't resist sneaking over to try the handle even though he knew those areas were reserved for mall staff and security personnel only. The door opened. A lanky figure in loose, baggy clothing stood over the sink in one of the personnel restrooms in the back corridors, washing his hands as the toilet flushed. The person sighed in exhaustion, looked up at himself in the mirror, and straightened his posture after finishing and shaking the extra water from his hands. "All right then. I guess it's showtime." Then, with a big, self-assured smile on his face, his body began to suddenly bulk up and inflate to perfectly fill out his loose clothing, transforming the man from a twig of a person into a mountain of muscle in a matter of seconds. Izuku was growing increasingly anxious as he wandered through the deserted hallways, regretting his choice more and more with each step. Why did he enter here in the first place? In addition to trespassing, he was doing it at a very inconvenient time when security was allegedly more of a problem than usual. He could run into a security guard or another employee at any moment and find himself in serious trouble. Creak a slam. GHRK. Thud. Or have a door suddenly swing open into his face, knocking him flat on his back. Oh my. For Izuku, for a time, everything had gone dark. The sensation of a big, strong palm repeatedly stroking his cheek caused him to gradually begin to regain consciousness. A scent, pat 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 pat. A loud voice said, "EY, hey, ah. Oh thank goodness, you're okay," as its owner stopped the constant patting. But Izuku's eyes widened at the sight of the smiling man who was now towering over him, and the shock alone nearly sent him unconscious once more. "Gay? You the boy cried in shock, scurrying wildly across the floor backwards. The man said, "And you're lively to boot," in response to his behavior as he stood back up to his full height. It turned out that the man who had unintentionally beamed him with the door and was now in front of him was the very person he had been looking for. All Might, the #1 hero. As he laughed uncomfortably, the legendary hero, dressed in a dark blue spandex uniform with red and white markings, a yellow belt, boots, and sleeves, lifted a muscular arm to rub the back of his head. "My bad there, youngster. I didn't mean to accidentally knock you flat like that. I just didn't expect there to be anyone else in these hallways right now, you see. Ah ha 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 ha." But Izuku wasn't really paying attention, and he didn't give a damn about his slightly bruised nose from the collision. He was just sitting astonished at the sight of the man in front of him, his eyes transformed into whirling spirals. Everything is powerful. T in person, right in front of me, the greatest hero himself. In his mind, the boy geeked out. I knew it. Seeing him in person like this is far more impressive than watching him on TV. As he gazed at him, the hero's enormous smile even glistened dramatically in the light of the hallway. Izuku exclaimed, that's right," as he abruptly stopped and began searching through his backpack until he found his hero journal notebook. If it's not too much trouble," he said, getting to his feet and holding it out straight, would you please grant me the honor of receiving your autograph? The hero took the journal and pulled out a large black marker from there. Ha ha, but of course. It's the least I could do in return for knocking you down like that, he said. Somewhere. However, are you sure you want to use this particular notebook, youngster? Looking at it, it appears to be a little tattered and burnt, doesn't it? Izuku's face wavered slightly as he remembered how Katsuki had previously burned it carelessly before discarding it with contempt. But it was also the only one he had with him, since all the other books in his bags were school only, and his older hero journals were at home. With a slightly phony smile, the boy said, "Why yes, it's all right. It's an important notebook to me, you see." Very well. If you say so. A few seconds later, Izuku was the proud owner of an autograph that was spread across 2 pages in big, bold letters and included an extra doodle of the hero's logo. Thank you so very much. Izuku bowed deeply and exclaimed in appreciation. I'll be sure to treasure it forever, like a family heirloom. Okay. You do that, kid, the hero said, quickly giving him the thumbs up as he put his marker away. Now if you'll excuse me, it is about time for me to appear on stage. I hope you will enjoy the show as well, youngster. However, Izuku's expression became conflicted as he froze in mid-bow as the beaming hero strode past him in the hallway. Then, after a moment of struggling with himself, he made himself move forward with it. He turned after the man and called out, Please, wait, there's one more thing I need to ask of you. The man said, I appreciate your dedication, my boy, as he proceeded on his journey, but I am really getting quite late and I shoulda. Can someone who's quirkless become a hero? The man stopped in his tracks at that. Can even someone born without a quirk possibly become like you, one day? As he turned to look over his shoulder, the hero noticed that the boy was standing very straight, trembling, and his eyes squeezed shut, as though it had taken all of his strength to ask him that specific question. As the boy began to look shyly down at his feet, All Might whispered to himself, someone who's quirkless, and went on. He began twiddling his thumbs and muttered, I have no quirk, so I'm always made fun of by everybody. Actually, that might not be entirely the only reason for it, but... Then he slowly started to smile. But even still, whatever the reason is for it, I still think saving people like you do is the coolest, most awesome thing ever. He said quietly. Saving and protecting people while flashing a fearless smile. I want to one day become a legendary hero like that as well. All Might sighed slowly and then turned his head back forward as the boy looked up and said that with a fragile yet unquestionable resolve in his eyes. With his eyes turned away from the boy, he thought, a fearless smile, Youngster. The hero biz may seem glamorous at a distance, but the truth of the matter is that every pro-hero, be they male or female, must be able to carry the burden and determination of being ready to give their all every day for the sake of upholding justice and protecting the innocent. Even if it means putting their very own lives on the line, All Might added softly as he turned to fully face the boy after letting a hand hover over the left side of his own abdomen without Izuku seeing. And that is why, without the edge that possessing a quirk would give you, however how slight, that I am afraid that I simply cannot in good conscience encourage you to try becoming a hero even without one. Izuku felt the last of his dreams and hopes crumble with that declaration. In response, the stunned boy looked down with wide, blind eyes and muttered, stupefied, I see. As he walked back to the discouraged boy, All Might added, if you aspire to help others, then there's always the police force. Some might demean them, claiming that their only role in today's society is taking villains that have already been captured by heroes into custody. But in my eyes, becoming an officer of the law is an occupation that is indeed worthy of praise. The hero reassured the slumbering boy by placing a big hand on his shoulder. I won't denigrate dreaming, he said. But be that as it may, you need to see reality for what it is, young man. All Might gave the boy a last pat on the shoulder as his cell phone began to buzz, and then he turned to leave again. I need to go now, youngster. You'd best get out of here as well, before the mall security catches you trespassing in these corridors. Izuku thought he heard All Might sheepishly apologize to Midnight, the other hero, over the phone as he left him behind. He assured her that he was on his way now and that he wasn't late because he had suddenly developed a nervous stomach, and that she was being a little impolite for implying that. Izuku, however, stayed put, biting at his trembling lip and gazing at the ground until the mythical hero had long since vanished. The loud voice echoed through the mall, apologies for the delay, everyone, and the commotion among the large crowd instantly stopped. But your waiting is now over. Why, you ask? The hero was spotted jumping over the edge and into the open air in the center of the mall as everyone turned to face the 6th-floor balcony. The man somersaulted through the air and continued unfazed, even as he fell several stories. He sailed down and landed dynamically in a crouch on the large stage on the ground floor, making it tremble slightly under the impact. "Because I have arrived," he exclaimed. As the great hero himself got up and waved to the cheering crowd, the stunned onlookers finally regained control of their vocal cords and erupted in a thunderous roar of applause that rocked the entire mall. Even Katsuki, who was up in front of the stage and close to the front of the crowd, was experiencing the tension as he smiled wildly at the sight of the hero in front of him. On the other hand, Izuku moved languidly forward as he descended the stairs on one of the upper floors, hoping to catch a glimpse of the stage below amid the throngs of excited spectators gathered along the railing. Even though the hero was still clearly visible on the big screen behind the stage, Izuku was unable to muster any enthusiasm as the event got underway. Leaning quietly against a stone column, the boy watched the show as best he could, his thoughts a whirlpool of confusion and a dejected expression on his face. A marble-sized metallic orb that had been lying undetected among the soil inside the urn of one of the mall's ornamental plants began to twitch and shake as energy currents arched across its surface. The large stone urn then broke apart as the orb instantly grew several times its own size. Dozens of additional orbs appeared in the same manner throughout the building as the shocked crowd turned to face the commotion. They broke through flooring, furniture, and columns as they appeared out of every crack, nook, and cranny that had previously been able to hide their presence. Large valves opened across the metallic sphere's surfaces as soon as they appeared, releasing viscous, noxious-looking fumes that instantly sent anyone inhaling them into a coughing fit. Additionally, because of the orb's placement throughout the building, the entire mall quickly filled with gas, causing the hundreds of people present to cough and heave in excruciating pain. However, this was just the start of the gas effects. Someone in the crowd saw the person next to them stoop forward and put their arm around themselves as their body trembled and seized as though experiencing a seizure, and they exclaimed, "Cough, cough, cough. Hey, buddy. Are you okay?" However, as they attempted to get close, the latter developed a glassy expression and a menacing red gleam in their eyes before attacking the worried stranger with an electrical-based quirk that knocked them flat. Another third person cried out in disbelief, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The attacker whirled around and blasted that person as well, but instead of getting a response, they just snarled in a fit of rage. In another part of the crowd, a mother with the same red tint in her eyes embraced her convulsing child against her chest and used her fire breath to blast anyone who dared approach them. In no time, there were people everywhere who had lost control of their senses and their quirks, and they began to lash out and go crazy like crazy animals in the crowded crowds. As the entire mall collapsed into chaos, transforming into a mad battlefield with wanton bursts of elements and energy arching through the air as everyone went insane and began attacking one another indiscriminately with their powers, Izuku, who was up on one of the balconies, could only watch in horror and disbelief. The man from earlier lay fully collapsed on the floor in a pool of perspiration, breathing the labored breaths of someone who had been compelled to push themselves to the limit and beyond, back in the dim room with the big screens. Calmly, the other person in the room congratulated him, saying, "Well done. You have performed admirably, my dear friend." As a long, thin shadow slithered through the air in an arch and then plunged into his back, stabbing all the way through with a sickening wet crunch and killing him, a quiet mechanical whir sounded, but the exhausted man on the floor was too busy trying to stabilize his own breathing to notice it. "As promised in return, I will not lay a hand upon your family. You can rest easy knowing you have successfully spared them my wrath." The shadows on the wall revealed the man's limp silhouette hanging in midair before the tentacle that had skewered him flicked him away towards the side of the room, while the crinkled, filthy photograph of the man grinning with his wife and kids floated down onto the floor. It then withdrew back to its origin, where the enigmatic man was seated in a sizable chair encircled by tall technological operating panels that he was using in conjunction with 3 more tentacles that similarly extended from his dark form. "Now then, the experiment is in progress," the dark figure said, putting his hands together thoughtfully while he sat in his chair. "The end results should be a spectacle to behold, indeed." Naturally, the gas that had permeated the building also seeped into the stores on the various floors, including the pet shop that Izuku had been looking into earlier. One creature began to violently writhe and convulse within its glass cage after the gas appeared, but the majority of the creatures inside didn't seem to be particularly disturbed by the strange fumes. A very large spider then slowly gathered its many hairy legs under itself again, and then it looked up, its many eyes glowing red. Humanity has advanced to the point where about 80% of people on the planet now exhibit the superhuman trait known as quirk. However, there are very few documented instances of quirks in animals worldwide, making their manifestations exceedingly uncommon. One of the seemingly normal animals in the pet store, however, turned out to be vulnerable to the effects of the gas that was causing quirk users to go crazy on this particular day as it spread throughout the large shopping mall. The large spider's body grew and bulked up until it had almost doubled in size, its many eyes taking on the same red tint as the other gas victims. After that, it began to trash wildly in its area of the spider terrarium, repeatedly hitting the glass panel that separated it from the adjacent pen until it finally cracked and then broke. The smaller spider breeds on the opposite side instinctively backed up and attempted to flee up their webbings when it entered the terrarium in a shower of broken glass, but ultimately they were pursued and quickly eaten one by one as the larger spider moved through the terrarium like an unstoppable predator. And splotches of strange colors began to grow and spread across its hide as it took more and more victims, and the animal itself gradually grew even larger. The sinister gas had sent almost everyone in the area completely insane, and the floors of the enormous shopping center were transformed into enormous free-for-all fights between hundreds of superpowered people. Outside the store, people were going absolutely crazy with their various abilities. And the mayhem was only getting worse. On the ground floor, where the crowd was densest, a woman was violently thrown back across the floor by someone else's wind quirk until she struck the side of a big ornamental fountain. The woman chose to use her own abilities to raise tall columns of water out of the fountain behind her and launch them towards her offender using hydrokinesis, striking them and multiple others in the process, rather than staying down or at least tending to her wound as blood began to trickle down her forehead. There was another high school girl in the crowd who grabbed at her head and collapsed to her knees, yelling as she created a protective whirlwind around herself that pushed and flung the crowd away. At the same time, a businessman who resembled a gorilla tore open his jacket and shirt and began beating his chest with his huge fists before leaping forward and viciously beating anyone nearby, behaving more like the animal he was than the human he was. Madness was in the air everywhere. However, regardless of whether the mall patrons were using wanton violence against one another or were just letting loose their uncontrollable energies in a random manner, they all now had the same characteristics: glazed, red-tinted eyes, and a near-total loss of inhibition and reason due to an overwhelming sense of aggression and hostility. Regardless of what this enigmatic gas was or where it came from, it seemed to have quickly turned everyone in the mall into dangerous, insane monsters. That is, everyone who just so happened to have a quirk. From where its owner was now hiding on the ground floor's edge, a voice softly whined, "Yuwa. Oh man. This is just horrible." As he had crept down the stairs and along the walls on his way down from the upper balconies, Izuku had mostly avoided drawing attention to himself from the frantic quirk users, keeping his head down to avoid the dangerous attacks and energies being tossed about. There had been a few near misses, where he had had to scramble to avoid an errant power blast, or when he had had to flee for his life to fend off a couple of assailants until they were apprehended by someone much more willing to defend themselves than he was, but he had finally made it to the ground floor with only minor injuries. That's what happens when you dive headfirst down a stairway for cover. Fortunately, at least some of it had been cushioned on the way down by the school backpack he was wearing. In any case, he had to exercise even more caution now that he was down here, because the next challenge was to find the closest exit without getting trapped in the enormous battleground that covered the ground floor. Sticking to the main hall's perimeter, Izuku avoided view by scuttling behind pillars and other obstacles as he moved slowly forward, crawling on his knees if necessary to avoid detection. However, he was crouching behind a floor-mounted billboard when a particularly large man screamed loudly, causing the boy to panic and run out into the open as he made a desperate run for the exit behind the billboard. "Oh okay. Just a bit more left," frantically, he thought as he slid forward on his knees to dodge an incorrect electric arch from someone's quirk. He then swiftly got back up on his feet and resumed his run. "I might be able to clear the rest of the crowd and get outside before anyone can I said, keeping my head down and running as quickly as I can. The boy was stopped in his tracks by a loud explosion in front of him, which had cleared away the section of the crowd between him and the exit, but it had also destroyed the exit itself by causing part of the wall and interior to collapse. As the dense smoke began to disperse, Izuku noticed that one lone figure stood upright at the epicenter, panting haggardly, among the people who had been randomly scattered and rendered unconscious by the unexpected blast. Izuku could have identified the figure from a distance, even with his back to it. "Ka. MRBLG Kacha," he began to call, but he stopped himself and covered his mouth with his hands. Regretfully, the other boy had heard him because he began slowly turning toward him in a zombie-like fashion. His menacing, red-tinted eyes were fixed on him, indicating that he was just as affected by the gas as everyone else. Deku. When Katsuki saw the green-haired boy a short distance away, his expression became even more manic than before, and he slurred out a deranged snarl, if such a thing were even possible. Izuku was frozen in place, his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with blood, knowing that he was now a real up shit creek, while explosive sparks popped continuously in the blonde's palms as he slowly began to shamble towards him. Oh my god, that crud! The glass cages of all the spider terrariums on the shelves up in the pet store had been smashed open as the quirk spider had repeatedly broken into each one to hunt down and eat its occupants, a process that apparently caused the creature to grow and expand to several times its original size. However, as it was consuming its most recent victim, it turned to face the storefront when two insane people burst through one of the big display windows. The spider left the almost decomposing carcass it was feeding on to crawl forward to the hole it had shattered in the glass cage to apparently peer at the humans from its shelf as the two fighters continued to scream at one another inside the store. However, it wasn't particularly interested in the fight. A seemingly invisible energy emitted from their bodies and arched and coiled through the air like wavy streams as they drifted towards the spider, which then took them into its body, after the first human, who had some sort of armored skin, was knocked onto his back and pounced upon by the second, who kept yelling at him with glowing fists. The splotches of color on the spider's hide continued to spread out as the streams poured into it, and its body also bulged and expanded, rapidly growing larger until it broke the small glass cage it was in by simply outgrowing its space. The now cat-sized spider crept along the walls and ceiling to stealthily enter the store and make its way to the broken display window, where it silently made its way out into the rest of the mall while the two humans were still fighting on the floor. As Katsuki slammed his hand forward and let out an explosion that tore straight through the pillar where he'd stood, a frightened Izuku was back and forth nervously against a stone column before hurling himself to the side. Knowing that the insane boy would be right on his tail, Izuku scurried to get back up and begin running as pieces and debris clattered across the floor around him. This gas has made Kachan completely lose it. The boy thought coldly as he fled, just like the others in the mall. If he catches me like this, he'll probably actually kill me, he thought. Deku, damn it. Quit running away, dude. Hey, Izuku squeaked as he had to roll forward to dodge another explosion that was coming from behind. Even though he was able to avoid the blast itself, the shockwaves that followed sent the boy flying across the floor until he rolled to a halt in the middle of a small section of the insane crowd. Even in their current red-hazed state, the addled and furious quirk users stopped fighting among themselves and instead loomed menacingly over the boy who had appeared among them, like a pack of wolves snarling at an encircled prey. However, they were still dumbfounded when the boy pushed off the floor and instantly slipped between their legs like a greased eel before running away, seemingly ignoring them completely. They were about to pursue the fugitive boy when they were suddenly hit by an explosion from behind, sending them flying in all directions like they were nothing more than rag dolls. They were blinking in confusion for a moment, amazed at how surprisingly deftly the boy had slipped through their fingers. Deku. The people on the floor were left sprawled and helpless as Katsuki snarled angrily and charged through the smoke and fumes. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Katsuki throw another explosion in his direction, forcing him to jump off to the side into a narrow hallway where he stumbled and crashed to the floor. Up ahead, Izuku skidded to a halt as the majority of the unruly crowd blocked off his paths going forward, being far too dense and chaotic to even consider trying to weave through it without getting caught in the battle himself. Huff, I have to get up. You must continue. He carefully pushed himself back up and stumbled forwards, wheezing frantically and drenched in sweat. The boy's spirits were raised by the presence of a personnel door at the very end of the corridor and doors leading into the bathroom stalls on the sidewalls, but unlike his luck in getting into the mall's back corridors earlier, this door would not budge no matter how hard he tried to handle, effectively trapping him. A dead end? Really? Izuku groaned frantically as, in spite of his best efforts, the door in front of him remained closed. A foot stomped heavily on the floor a short distance behind the poor boy, who was so frustrated that he wanted to tear out his hair. Oh my god. Deku, hee. A voice slurred behind him, causing him to stiffly turn his head to see Katsuki hover at the entrance of the corridor, swaying unsteadily on his feet with a deranged and sinister grin on his face. Nowhere for Yhuu to rune no. Nerd. Yhuu shitty. Drool frothed out the side of his mouth as he growled through clenched teeth. KK Kachan. Izuku called as he whirled around and desperately pressed his back against the wall. Keep back, please. This is not something you want to do. Despite his entreaties, however, The other boy was obviously beyond reason, and Izuku didn't believe Bakugo could even understand what he was saying to him in his red-hazed, addled state. Like the other afflicted, Bakugo's quirk had gone into overdrive due to the gas, and he began to stagger forwards in a menacing manner while his hands continued to produce tiny, pocket-sized explosions. "Deku!" Bakugo growled again. As he got closer, however, a dull, dripping sound accompanied the pops and sparks. Upon closer inspection, Izuku saw that the boy's hands were bloodied and badly bruised from the excessive use of his power, splattering blood on the ground with every new pop from his explosions, and the boy himself didn't even appear to notice. With his quirk channeled through the nitroglycerin sweat generated in his palms, Izuku realized that if this continued, the boy might irreparably damage his hands, destroying any chance the boy had of ever becoming a professional hero as he had always desired. The other boy would finally experience what it was like to be weak and powerless, just as he had always mocked him for being. Maybe it would be to his advantage if that were to occur. No, he couldn't think that way. Izuku was truly embarrassed that he had even considered it, even for a brief moment. Izuku knew better than anyone how hard the other boy had worked over the years with the intention of becoming a hero. Even though his childhood friend, who was also a bully, had a rotten personality and anger management problems that were miles wide. The objective that, in their better days, they had once shared as friends. The boy stood resolute and clenched his fists, steeling his resolve, even though, in all honesty, right now all he wanted was to dissolve into a blubbering mess and hope that it would all go away. "Ah. What's up with your look, ours?" Katsuki craned his head as Izuku suddenly faced the approaching boy with a nervous but determined look in his eyes. "Bastard. Do you think I look DHOWN?" Despite the cold perspiration streaming down his cheek, Izuku's eyes remained fixed. "Deku." Katsuki started to charge slowly, leaning his torso forward. "All right, Midoriya, concentrate," Izuku told himself in his head. "You've seen him do this innumerable times before." "Deku." As the micro-explosions in his palms intensified and grew faster, Katsuki kept accelerating. "You've had years of fantasies about confronting him, but you've always been too timid to do it." "Deku." With a growl, Katsuki threw back his right arm and unleashed a powerful blast. "This is it, Daiya, what?" As Katsuki swung his arm forward, the slightly smaller boy abruptly stepped into his charge, grabbed him around it, and used his own momentum to throw him over his shoulder and flat onto his back, cutting short Katsuki's war cry. "Gah-ha!" He spat after hitting the floor hard and coughing repeatedly after being knocked out of his breath. As he stood over him, Izuku thought frantically in triumph. It worked. It actually worked. But no time to dilly-dally, he added hastily. As it turned out, the insane boy was tough and was already beginning to get back up, which was not something that could be permitted at this time. "I apologize, Kachan, it's for your own benefit." "Grr, huh? Ki haufech." A fist buried itself in the boy's face before he could even sit up and turn his head. Texas smash. When Izuku punched the other boy with all of his strength and sent him reeling, he screamed, imitating one of his hero's battle cries. After that, both boys let out cries of agony. Izuku thought he might have broken something in his hand from the blow, while Katsuki smacked down against the floor again. Despite holding his sore fist, Izuku's gaze was fixed on Katsuki's twitching body. "Please, please, 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 stay down." With bloodshot eyes and a bleeding, bruised nose, Katsuki slowly began to stir and lifted his torso just enough to give him a final glare before falling flat on the ground once more, unconscious. "Oh." Izuku fell to his knees and exhaled. "Oh, thank God." He honestly didn't think he could have taken it if the other boy had stood up again after that. He sighed with relief, at last able to concentrate on the pain in his hand. "Ah, OWWW. He screamed. "I guess that's going to leave a mark. Though your technique may indeed have been amateurish, that was a fine smash indeed." Izuku spun around at the sound of the newcomer and saw that it was none other than All Might himself, towering in the corridor entrance with multiple forms slung over his enormous shoulders or beneath his arms. "Hey, All Ma." He walked up to the stuttering Izuku and said, "We meet again, youngster. I was attempting to control this chaos to some extent by at least containing the more destructive quirk users here when I noticed the string of explosions occurring in this area. I rushed over as quickly as circumstances would permit, but I only got there in time to see you taming the boy by yourself. His quirk is extremely dangerous when it gets out of control, and this gas might have caused him to do something he would regret for the rest of his life. but you handled the situation expertly. Excellent work. Aye. Izuku, unable to believe he was truly being praised by the great hero, stammered nervously, I kind of know him since childhood, so. He blinked as an idea came to him. Hang on. The gas doesn't affect you, All Might. As he considered his response, the big man who had passed him was carefully laying down the unconscious individuals he had been carrying at the end of the short hallway. Well, I wouldn't say that it has no effect on me at all. He smiled and flexed an arm to demonstrate his point, but for the time being, I'm able to grit my teeth and bear it. Amazing. To be able to withstand a gas aimed at quirk users. Izuku praised him, as one might anticipate from the renowned #1 hero. What amazing strength. As he picked up Katsuki and put him with the others, All Might muttered uneasily, yes. I guess you could say that. In private, the hero believed that the moment he saw that Izuku was completely fine and unaffected despite the gas residual density, his suspicions about the nature of the gas as well as his own resistance towards it were more or less confirmed. Still, I have already called and informed the authorities about what's happened here, the hero said as he washed his hands. They're already setting up a perimeter around the building to prevent the rampage from spreading until they're fully prepared to deal with the situation inside. Then All Might casually pried open the personnel door, the lock unable to withstand the hero's incredible strength. Hopefully they shouldn't take too long, but until then, you just take cover inside these back corridors while I return into the fray and try to calm down the chaos as best I can. What? However, there are hundreds of people in the world. Even if you have to suppress your strength against them, you will never be able to defeat them all by yourself. I still need to try, though. This, after all, is my duty. Keep your head down, and good luck, youngster. The hero then marched back towards the corridor's entrance, leaving Izuku speechless in awe. As he took in the chaos that had been caused by all those innocent people who had been driven insane by the horrible gas, All Might briefly felt overwhelmed by the situation before he steeled his nerves and readied himself to literally jump back into action. Just as he was ready to lift himself off the ground, though, he sensed two tiny arms encircling his middle from behind. All Might, hold on, Wah. What are you doing, kid? He called up to the boy who was holding his belly. I know you must be scared, but there are others who need my help as well, and I musta. It's not that. Izuku interrupted him as he looked up at him, his eyes displaying both fear and resolve. I have an idea. I know how you can stop everyone without hurting them, all in one fell swoop. Wah? All Might asked, raising his powerful eyebrows. Really, my boy? Izuku gave him a curt nod in return. Multicolored streams of energy, invisible to the naked eye, rose up from the various fighters and arched up into the air as the main hall's rampage between the afflicted quirk users continued. These streams of energy swirled and twisted around one another like a rainbow-colored typhoon, rising all the way to the very top of the building, where the quirk spider had perched itself upon the ceiling, high above it all. It took the unseen, passively emitted energies that radiated from all that active quirk usage and drew them up directly into itself, sitting almost perfectly safe from being drawn into the dangerous chaos down below. The strands and streams of energy fed continuously into its body, making its hide and even some of its physical features turn more and more unnatural the more it absorbed. And as its overall size increased even more, its body's contours flexed and bulged throughout it all. All Might was back in the center of the maddening crowd in the main hall a few moments later, using ultra-light karate chops to subdue some of the more destructive quirk users he encountered to the backs of their necks as he waded through the crowds and kept moving his head back and forth, constantly looking around for something or someone in particular. He finally found what he was looking for up above on the 6th-story balcony, but it was hard to see anything at a great distance due to the gas leaking into the air. All Might leaned forward and pushed off the ground in a mighty leap after purposefully knocking out and laying down a crazy civilian who had attempted to attack him while the hero's eyes were focused upwards. He bounced off the 4th-story balcony on the opposite side of the large hall like a pinballing rocket before arriving and vaulting over the railing on the 6th, landing intentionally a certain distance away from where his target happened to be. This individual, who stood at the foot of a lengthy stack of unconscious bodies, was not just any quirk user. She was a professional hero in her own right who had also been affected by the evil gas and was now, like the other victims, going on a rampage with her supercharged quirk. Since the nature of her quirk had already rendered everyone in her wake completely helpless, she was instantly drawn to All Might's appearance on the otherwise idle balcony, even though he was far away. Recalling his earlier conversation with the quirkless boy, All Might saw the black-haired woman spin around and give him a crazy, red-eyed glare through her domino mask. Rewind. Ms. Midnight, you say? Yeah, She was part of the security of this event, right? Her quirk allows her to knock unconscious anyone who inhales the sleep-inducing aroma she can exude from her body, making her perfectly suited for dealing with violent crowds. With her help, you should be able to stop this rampage in no time. However, All Might appeared suspicious. But if she's fallen victim to the gas like everyone else in the mall, it's unlikely she'll be willing to aid us. Izuku interrupted, wearing a surprisingly sly little smile. That doesn't really matter, he said. As long as she's actively releasing her quirk into the air, that's all we need. What you need to do, All Might, is see to it that she covers a larger area with it. Final flashback. As he prepared himself, All Might thought, youngster, you're a shrewd one. There wasn't a single scratch on the woman at the other end of the balcony, but it looked like she tore several tears across her already fairly revealing outfit during her outburst, probably to increase the amount of exposed skin releasing the sleep-inducing aroma of her quirk into the open air. The male hero took a deep breath and held it before rushing forward like a bullet in her direction as Midnight cracked her whip and stalked forward, trying to bring him within her quirk's effective range. All Might caught the woman over his free arm with one hand clamped firmly over his lower face and proceeded at inhuman speed, carrying her over his shoulder as he circled the entire balcony floor, causing any stragglers they passed to fall like dominoes after smelling the scent they left behind. In his rush to expose every single person in the mall to the sedative scent emanating from the woman behind him, All Might raced down the stairs and then repeated the procedure on the descending levels one by one all the way down to the ground floor, zipping through the crowds of unruly citizens like a rocket. After shooting through the main hall almost a dozen times, the hero finally skidded to a stop and looked around at the suddenly almost silent mall, which was only disturbed by the sound of snores from the hundreds of bodies that were now slumped all around him and on the balconies above. All Might turned to face the snarling woman who had been writhing ineffectually in his grasp the entire time, and he quickly chopped the back of her neck to calm her down as well. The hero swiftly waved away any possible residue after he was positive she was no longer using her quirk, and then he let himself release a sharp exhale and take a deep breath. After the intense effort, he spluttered, gasp, cough, cough, cough. "Oh, that's better," as perspiration trickled down his cheek. After regaining his composure, All Might cautiously emerged from the sea of strewn bodies and carefully set the woman down on an empty, and largely undamaged, wooden bench before turning to face the middle school boy who was stealthily approaching him from his hiding place. Izuku lowered the handkerchief he had been holding over his mouth and nose up until now, just in case, and looked around the mall, asking incredulously, wow. Did you really manage to get all of them? Ha ha. Do not worry, youngster. I traversed every corner of this place to make sure everyone received a whiff of Ms. Midnight's quirk and quietly went down for the count. Truly, things might have turned out much worse if not for her presence. I'll need to make sure she receives the proper accolades for the part she played here today. As they gazed down at the unconscious female hero, Izuku gave a slight nod of agreement. And I need to do the same for you as well, All Might abruptly added, turning to face him then. He smiled and gave a thumbs up, saying, "We couldn't have done it without your input either, my boy," which made the young child start to get anxious again. "I didn't do anything special," he denied right away, gesturing restlessly. Really, it was all you, All Might." "Yeah, why you really are amazing." "Nonsense. Your plan worked perfectly. I wouldn't really call it a plan, as such. It was just an idea that struck me. Though, the child suddenly appeared to shift gears. I've read that Midnight's quirk supposedly works better on men than women. Hopefully the effect will still last long enough for the authorities to arrive and get the entire area under control first. I hope that they hurry. In the meantime we should probably check the crowd for serious injuries. Some of them might have gotten badly hurt during the chaos and be in need of tending. We should probably split up in order to cover more ground more efficiently. Yeah." The professional hero watched him drone on with a raised eyebrow before shaking his head and laughing as the boy stood with a hand on his chin in an analytical manner and muttered and mumbled under his breath at an ever-increasing rate. This child was really something else. All Might had to acknowledge that the boy had both a heart and a brain, despite his nervous demeanor, which was akin to that of a hamster overdosed on caffeine. Although he might never be able to become the specific kind of hero he had always envisioned, the top hero believed that the boy could make a difference even in the absence of a quirk and wanted to share this with him in the hopes that he would come to understand that for himself. However, his vision went hazy and briefly turned red as he reached for the boy and attempted to relight some of the embers he had been forced to trample on with such callousness earlier. Izuku's digressions were interrupted when he heard the great hero groan in pain. He then staggered unsteadily to lean against a stone column and cover his face with his hand while attempting to steady his breathing. All might. What's wrong? Shit. A delayed response? As he looked through his fingers with blurry eyes and was drenched in sweat, the hero thought. This is not good. The gas seems to be finally affecting me too. Looking down at the worried boy who was calling out to him, All Might saw that his vision was distorted and changing erratically, turning the figure in front of him into something ominous and terrifying that he felt he had to protect himself from, and that he couldn't hear his voice above the thundering of his own heartbeat. He had to destroy it. As the shocked boy flinched away from him, All Might regained his senses long enough to recognize the monstrosity for the terrified child that he truly was. The hero grasped hold of himself, both literally and figuratively, to keep his impulses from going berserk like the others in the mall had. His muscles tensed, and the stone column began to crack under his grip. All Might. I suppose I have no other option, goddammit. Izuku was terrified and worried that the great, and unstoppable, hero was also finally succumbing to the evil gas. He watched as plumes of smoke abruptly began to trail off of All Might's body one by one, and then the hero shrank and shriveled up in front of his eyes until all that was left was a lanky skeleton of a man standing there panting heavily in an enormous superhero costume. The boy's eyes almost popped out of his skull at the sight, as one might expect. He hunched forward and coughed into his fist as the gaunt-looking man said, Please calm down, youngster. Cough, cough, in a dreary and dull voice. My head is pounding enough as it is. Izuku exclaimed, But what happened to you? In shock. Was it the gas? Did the gas do this to you? Cough, yes. And no, the gas was indeed starting to affect my mind like the others, so I needed to power down to ensure I wouldn't run amok and do something horrible with my strength before it was too late. The column he had previously broken beneath his fingers decided to break and fall apart behind them at that precise moment, as if to punctuate that statement. Fortunately, the act of doing so appears to have returned me to my senses as well. Izuku was still unable to comprehend what he was seeing as he examined this figure, from his slender build to his blood-dripping mouth. He muttered, considering the hero's wording, You powered down, are you saying that this is your true form? He wheezed as he briefly raised his shirt to reveal the injury, causing the boy to recoil in horror. Cough, in a manner of speaking. Due to a grievous injury I received a few years ago that destroyed my stomach, as well as half of my respiratory organs. This is what I've been reduced to, and I can now only bring my full strength out to bear for a few hours a day, he said. It appeared as though the man had once had his guts removed by hand, despite the fact that it had clearly been surgically treated. Which might or might not have been the actual event. It was astounding to consider that despite having such a horrific wound, the man was still able to function at all. Izuku was startled out of his daze as the man proceeded slowly, his mind racing with such thoughts. But society still needs its symbol of peace, so I've done my best to hide this fact from the world at large so that my presence can continue to deter evil and inspire the next generation of heroes. He breathed a sigh of relief as he pulled back, and so I've soldiered on, all the while wearing a brilliant smile to showcase the might of heroes, as well as to distract myself from my own crippling fears and anxieties. That's why it's important that you keep this discovery to yourself, my boy, the short man said fiercely as he stepped forward and took the boy by the shoulder. We've come a long way, but at this point in time our society is still at a crucial stage. And if people were to find this out, if villains were to learn of this, then the world order as we know it might crumble and tear itself apart. That absolutely cannot be allowed that to happen. Do you understand, youngster? I. Izuku stumbled uncertainly under the intense blue stare of the man. A large monstrous shadow appeared through the gas several stories above, rapidly descending towards them, forcing the boy to crane his neck upwards to face the man who was now towering over him. This position, however, coincidentally allowed him to see something beyond the man's head. Observing the boy's abrupt stiffening, All Might said, What's the matter, my boy? Because of its enigmatic ability, the quirk spider had been able to absorb enough energy from the crowd below to grow to utterly monstrous proportions while clinging to the ceiling all the way at the very top of the building. Only 2 living people remained on the ground floor after that well of sustenance was abruptly cut off, just as everyone else in the mall had been rendered unconscious. And since there was no longer any quirk energy emanating, the monster spider had made the decision to feed right at the source, beginning with the lone quirk user who was still alive. Izuku saw it just in time to respond instinctively as it lunged down towards its prey, trailing thread and exposing its enormous fangs. He yelled, look out! as he pushed the slack-legged man out of the monster's path, putting himself squarely in its path as it slammed him down and onto his back, sinking its poisonous teeth deep into his shoulders and neck. When the car-sized spider jumped down on the boy in front of him, All Might yelled in shock, "Why, youngster?" from where he had been shoved. "Ah!" Izuku cried out at the top of his lungs as the creature pierced his flesh and began to inject his venom, igniting his internal organs in a terrible agony. It didn't last long, though, because All Might had picked himself up off the ground behind the spider and swiftly forced himself to change back into his muscular hero form, ignoring the discomfort and negative effects that the gas and his condition were causing him. "You! Get off of him!" he screamed, leaping toward it while craning his arm back. Texas smash. The enormous spider monster's body trembled with energy as the shockwave from the blow passed through it before it was practically flung off its prey and into the air. The punch was strong and went deep into its gut. The spider, however, was able to correct itself and land back on its legs, skidding to a halt backwards across the floor, much to the hero's astonishment. "I am possible," said All Might, almost in shock. "It weathered it? No, it absorbed it?" The monster's body was crackling with arcs of energy, and it was beginning to grow even bigger again, so it appeared that was the case. The force and energy from All Might's direct blow, however, was just too much for it to absorb quickly, in contrast to the energy it had already absorbed. As a result, parts of its body began to swell and bulge excessively, until its exoskeleton began to burst and spit out streams of mucus and blood. After convulsing and curling in on itself, the entire thing literally exploded outward, clattering long, hairy limbs across the floor and spouting gore and goo at everything in its path. With a sigh of relief that the threat had finally been neutralized, All Might immediately focused on the wounded boy who was writhing wildly on the ground in agony, clutching at his wounds and screaming non-stop. He called out, "Cough, calf my boy, speak to me," and knelt down to hold him, ignoring the blood splattering over his own lips. "Are you alright? Please, answer me?" By the time police officers and heroes wearing gas masks finally arrived and were able to enter the building, the boy in his arms was still screaming. The paramedics and those helping them were able to freely tend to the many victims on the spot because of All Might's actions and the authorities' prompt response, which enabled heroes who could neutralize or gather up the gas inside the mall to be quickly called in. Even though it was found that the gas itself had no lasting effects on those who inhaled it, many people still needed to be hospitalized for a variety of reasons, including severe exhaustion from using their quirks excessively or injuries they or others sustained during the chaos. In the end, there were no deaths because of the efforts of some of the nation's most renowned physicians, many of whom had quirks that enabled them to heal or treat their patients extremely effectively. Unfortunately, a sizable portion of the victims would still suffer from physical and/or psychological scars as a result of this experience. However, despite their best efforts, Midoriya Izuku continued to toss and scream for hours on end as the mutated poison continued to ravage his system, leaving even these famous medical professionals and healers unsure of how to handle his case. Ultimately, the best they could do was to keep him stable and sedated while his body attempted to withstand the effects. This left poor Inko waiting at the hospital for several anxious days while her son continued to teeter on the edge of life and death. Although it was touch and go for a long time, the boy's chances of surviving were at last beginning to improve. Only for the crash team to discover a huge spider web cocoon hanging over the bed where their patient used to be when they were rushing to his room one day in response to an alarm. After a thorough analysis and discussion, it was determined that the patient's body had begun to change and adapt to withstand the poison. Therefore, it was safer to leave the cocoon alone for the time being and move it to a higher security wing of the hospital where it could be even more closely watched in case of any eventuality, good or bad. Months went by in an instant, which brings us to the present at last. With a puzzled look on his face, Izuku silently observed the gaunt and gangly man kneeling in front of him while tracing his fingers absently over the faint fang marks left beneath his collar. With a self-deprecating sigh, Toshinori Yagi said, "I pride myself on being the symbol of peace. The #1 hero." His voice was so quiet and languid that it was a stark contrast to his raucous All Might persona. But on that day, the one who truly saved everyone, including myself in my moment of weakness, was none other but a quirkless young boy. The very same boy that I had earlier told could never become a hero. The man gave a headshake. "Despite trampling upon your dream, you still went as far as to put your life on the line to save mine. It was a thoroughly humbling experience. And I swore to myself that if given the chance, if you successfully recovered, then I would do my very best to repay this department I owe, one way or another," he solemnly stated before reaching for something in his coat. "Starting with returning this." Izuku realized. Ah, that's, as the hero produced a recognizable, frayed notebook. As he handed it to the boy, Toshinori Yagi explained, I found your hero journal on the floor after the paramedics hurried carting you off from the mall. I suppose you lost it back when you were attacked by that monstrously huge spider, and so I've been safeguarding it up till now, where I am finally able to return it to its rightful owner. Upon nervously taking it in his hands, Izuku had begun paging through the journal's pages to confirm its contents and condition. The boy abruptly stopped when he noticed something else, even though the frayed journal didn't appear to be any more worn than it had been before. This is. Toshinori grinned a little because the boy had already noticed the surprising additions to his journal. Ah, yes. That, he said. While it was in my care, I took the liberty of asking if Ms. Midnight was willing to write down her signature for you as well. However, once she got involved, things sort of snowballed from there. To say that was an understatement. Some of the journal's later, blank pages were now filled with numerous names written in a variety of fonts, styles, and sizes. These were all the private autographs of well-known pro-heroes, the elite of the elite. After Death Goro and Kamui Woods, whose modest signature was partially hidden by her larger and more flamboyant one. Even someone like Mountain Lady, who had been a relative newcomer to the hero scene prior to his hospitalization, had signed her name in the journal. Toshinori let out a low hum as he watched the boy turning the pages with a fascinated expression on his face, making sure to read each and every signature. I hope I wasn't acting out of turn using your notebook this way, youngster. As he turned back to the original autograph he had received, the shocked boy said, I don't know what to say. Before grinning up at the person who had originally signed it. Izuku told him, thank you, All Might. Thank you so much, holding the journal close to his chest as tears of appreciation threatened to well up in his eyes. I can't even begin to describe how much this means to me. I'll treasure it, always. The hero in question gave him a curt nod, and the other people in the room smiled placidly at the boy's truly sincere expression. No, it was the least I could do, he reassured him, looking pleased at the positive reception his gift had received. As All Might, I originally tried to hand it over to your mother back when you were first hospitalized, but after informing her of the role you'd played that day, she instead convinced me to hang on to it until I could one day return it to you in person. It seems it was a good thing she did, as the months I kept it in my safekeeping allowed me to collect quite a number of signatures. Izuku wiped his tears and nodded, surprised that his mother was involved. I see, he said. I hope it wasn't too much of a hassle for you, taking care of this thing. No, not at all, the hero said with a friendly sneer before slanting sideways and resting a hand on his chin in thoughtful contemplation. In fact, it was a privilege. It truly was an amusing piece of work you've compiled there. You might have heard a pin drop in the room all of a sudden. Izuku's one eye, which was visible beneath his grown-out hair, widened in surprise, and he sat motionless. Why you mean you've read through it? Ah, said the hero, skittering, was I not allowed to? Izuku muttered uneasily, no, that's not it, and then shyly turned away. It's just notes I make on heroes and quirks as a hobby. But I'm sure they must all seem so juvenile in the eyes of an authentic hero like yourself. Not at all. In fact, I found its contents to be quite intriguing. Don't you think so as well, Principal Nedzu? Why, yes. That journal of yours made for a very interesting read. The UA principals read it too. Izuku became even more alarmed. Why? Why would you go and show it too? Conk. Ow, ouch. With a sigh, Dr. Shuazenji pulled out her cane and gave Izuku a gentle tap on the head. Calm down, lad, she said. All Might didn't show your notebook to us merely as a jest. So you've read it as well, Doctor, Izuku whimpered feebly as he massaged his aching scalp. Toshinori asked humbly, by the way, why did you hit me as well just now? The truth of the matter is that he wanted us to judge your potential for a possible enrollment at UA. Are you ignoring me? Enrollment? Based on my journal? Izuku asked again, stunned by what he was hearing. After taking a quick sip of his tea, the principal stated, yes, the theories and analytical studies within regarding heroes and their quirks were quite insightful and well put together. You possess an undeniable talent for analyzing and deducing a quirk's strength and weaknesses, as well as thinking up potential and quite imaginative ways that they could be utilized. These qualities of yours are something that would be well appreciated at our school. In response to Izuku's feeble and somewhat perplexed response, the rodent-like principal chose to go into further detail. Leaving aside the Department of Heroics and General Ed. For now, there's the Department of Management where the students are educated to handle the bureaucratic and public relation aspects of hero offices and the hero industry. And then there's also the Department of Support. While it's mostly oriented towards the youths who will one day develop and maintain the gear and other supportive apparatuses for students and pro-heroes alike, there's a growing logistics division as more and more heroes have started to realize the importance of having someone monitoring the situation from a distance who's capable of providing them valuable intel as well as strategic advice while they're out in the field, he continued. Not unlike how you gave All Might the idea and method for how to handle the incident at the mall without having to resort to harming any of the numerous victims of the gas. Dr. Shuazenji sighed as she leaned back and rested her arm on her desk to support her head while the boy remained silent. Lad, did you never even consider the options of applying for any of those departments before, back when you were quirkless? No, not really, he confessed, appearing preoccupied with his own ideas. I'm ashamed to say it, but I guess the thought never really occurred to me. After all he had ever heard throughout his life was what he couldn't become. The elderly doctor snorted and propped her arm up on her desk to support her head. Tisk. Talk about a one-track mind, lad, she said. With a hiss of obvious disgust, she continued, honestly, what in the world are the middle school teachers and guidance counselors doing these days? The stakes were clearly set when Toshinori Yagi jumped to his feet in front of Izuku, who was clearly having trouble understanding the positive remarks and attitudes these powerful people were making about him. He managed to project a small amount of the bombastic energy associated with his other, more muscular form as he declared, this was one of the ways I intended to repay you for everything you did that day. For you, a hero otaku who's always dreamed of becoming a hero yourself despite lacking a quirk, these departments were and still are both reasonable, as well as admirable alternate routes that you could choose to take instead. Izuku thought All Might was correct. He could make valuable contributions to the hero society even if he wasn't the one engaging in combat or saving lives. He could still have an impact even if he didn't end up becoming a hero. Still, though, the man abruptly went on, however, the situation has changed, as he towered over the boy, jolting him out of his reverie and pointing a finger at his face. Against all odds, you've somehow managed to come out of this with a quirk of your own. Now that the fates have granted you this opportunity, will you not try to seize it with all your might and run towards your true dream once more? All Might's dramatic declaration caused Izuku to stiffen, but the hero's proud posture was ultimately undone when the small old doctor gave him a solid thwack over the leg. Ow! I already told you earlier not to push the boy too much too quickly, you humongous moron. Toshinori accepted, I'm sorry, as he hopped in place and held his aching leg. I got a little carried away again, I guess. There's nothing little about it. Thwack, ouch, again. And my other leg this time? From his chair, Principal Nedzu reassured the young boy, you don't have to decide right away, Midoriya-kun. What department you want to apply for, or even if you want to study at UA at all, it can all wait until you've completed your basic rehabilitation. Either way, our offer will still. The other two adults turned as the principal abruptly stopped talking, revealing that the boy was sitting with his head bent forward and his hands, which were resting on his knees, clenched into trembling fists. Toshinori tried to say, Midoriya, my boy, but the boy began to speak in a trembling voice before he could get close. As drops of liquid began to fall onto his hospital pajama pants from somewhere beneath that unruly mop of hair, he gargled, Do you really think that someone like me could become a hero? Toshinori took a deep breath to gather himself as the boy's shoulders began to tremble as well. Youngster, despite your timidness, despite your quirklessness and understandable fear back at the mall, there's no denying the fact that we were all saved thanks to you. The victims of the gas, as well as myself when you leapt forward and shielded me from that spider's attack in my weakened state. Despite being just a scared, powerless middle schooler, you demonstrated both the brains as well as the heart worthy of nothing less but a top hero. KHC, Izuku screeched in his chair, trying to hold back a cry. Whether you wish to support pro-heroes in the field with your analytical mind, or pair it together with your newfound abilities to fight injustice with your own hands, there is no doubt in my mind that you can provide a great difference to those in need of aid out there. Before the man's arm landed on his trembling shoulder, the boy was now frantically gripping the front of his shirt in an attempt to control himself. Izuku saw that even though Toshinori was now emaciated, the intense weight and glow in his piercing blue eyes spoke volumes about the fact that he was still unquestionably the hero of heroes, All Might himself. This was evident when he finally raised his head back up and revealed that he was now crying freely from all 8 of his eyes. As Toshinori put it calmly and resolutely, so to answer your question, youngster, you can indeed be a hero. I am certain of it. That was the last straw, after all. Izuku grimaced in a last-ditch effort to suppress his emotions, then collapsed to his knees on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably from the emotional toll of not only having his dream recognized for the first time in his life, but also by his idol. The principal and the doctor closed their eyes and smiled quietly as Toshinori calmly comforted the weeping boy by bending down and keeping his hand on his shoulder. Shortly afterward, Izuku's mother rushed back towards and entered the room as Izuku's sobs naturally carried outside. She barely missed Toshinori Yagi's form as the shocked hero miraculously changed back into All Might at the last second. The principal gave Inko the essential information and then proceeded to give her boy a tight, maternal hug after he finally composed himself enough to tell her that his tears were coming from joy rather than sadness. Izuku was then forced to comfort his mother. Principal Nedzu told the two that he would leave the boy in the care of the small female doctor for the time being and take a leave of absence so that he could resume his work at UA and begin preparing for Izuku's proposed rehabilitation program after letting the Midoriya family enjoy their time together. Izuku managed to give them both heartfelt bows of appreciation for everything they were doing for him before he left the room with a somewhat disheveled All Might in tow, his heart still pounding from being almost exposed. He promised to get in touch with them again in a few days. Later, the little rodent man grinned up at his companion as they walked down the corridor. He remarked amicably, "You've certainly gone and lit a fire in that boy now, All Might. I hope you're prepared to take responsibility for it and follow this through." All Might grunted and wiped a trail of blood down his chin. "Murin. Not to worry," he said. "Not only do I plan to periodically check in on the progress of his rehabilitation, but as promised, I will accept your terms to take up a teaching position at the school starting next semester." The principal nodded a little. "HN. While I wish you'd have come over a little more willingly, I'm glad you've finally seen the merit of my proposal," he said with a slight sigh. "While having you contribute to directly guiding the next generation of heroes is a welcome bonus, offering you this position at UA was mostly made with your benefit in mind, you know." With a defeated sigh, All Might said, "Why yes. I am aware. Our deal aside though, I'm still grateful for all your assistance concerning young Midoriya." Nedzu shouted, "Don't think about it," and dismissed him. "Like you, I also see the possible potential hidden in that boy, both regarding his character as well as this new quirk of his." The hero thought in a detached voice, yes. To think that monster somehow managed to bestow upon him the one thing he desired most. While I'm indeed happy for the boy, I must however admit that I'm also a little disappointed. The principal hummed knowingly as he saw how the hero was examining his own raised fist in contemplation. He whispered, "I see. I suspected as much," he said. "So you really were planning to offer him the chance to be your successor?" "Perhaps." All Might lowered his fist in a quiet admission, but there's no telling how the unnatural quirk he has now could correspond with something like one for all, so it's probably best to consider that that ship has sailed. No matter how much of a shame it might be. The statement, yes. It might be quite a shame indeed, was acknowledged by Nedzu. But successor or not, we still need to do our very best to ensure his safety and well-being. "Yes," All Might said, his voice growing solemn. "Due to the circumstances regarding the creation of his quirk, there's likely some who'd see the boy as nothing but a curious and intriguing research specimen to be contained and analyzed in a lab somewhere. And even more worryingly are the dark forces in this world who would want to exploit whatever they could glean from his mutation for their own selfish and nefarious means. Indeed. That is why we must try to keep the true nature of the boy hidden from the general public. At the very least until such a time when he's capable of defending himself by his own power." The hero nodded and clenched his fist again. "Yes, that's right. The boy deserves to live a life of his own choosing. And I will protect his right to do so with all that I have. This I swear." A telephone receiver in a larger console panel at an undisclosed location began to ring, and soon a metallic tentacle with claws picked it up and carried it to the side of a man's head. "Yes?" the individual asked expectantly, then hummed in curiosity while the person on the other end spoke. The man grinned and rubbed his chin with a regular human hand. "I see. So not only has the subject finally emerged, but as the preliminary studies suggested, he's now in possession of an artificially developed quirk. Yes. Very interesting indeed," he said. "Continue to keep me posted." The man began typing away with both human and metallic appendages as the tentacle withdrew with a mechanical whir to return the receiver. This brought up a number of documents and photographs on the large computer console in front of him, including classified government studies on the quirk spider's disorganized remains, hacked hospital files, and even a photo of Izuku's web cocoon from where it was kept under observation in the hospital's fortified wing. "Quirkless middle schooler helps top heroes save the day," was the headline of a saved news article. A picture of the unassuming boys' school ID appeared on the screen, and the man thought, "Midoriya Izuku, huh? While my experiment may not have performed completely to specifications, yours is a most spectacularly intriguing side effect." He laughed softly, drumming his fingers together. One that bears further study. The young boy, whose name was Midoriya Izuku, stumbled forward as he hurried down the quiet and empty streets, his silhouette slowly emerging through the dense morning fog. The boy had to jump over debris and avoid craters in the road as he ran because the city was partially in ruins, as though a major battle had just taken place here. Furthermore, he could not see a soul wherever he looked, which gave the impression that he was in a deserted ghost town. However, it was evident that Izuku at least didn't think he was alone in this place because the boy continued to look frantically around and back over his shoulders through the big, shaggy mop of hair that covered half of his face. There, as if stalking his movements, the shadow of a predatory figure could be seen darting past the opening on the opposite side of the buildings down a narrow alleyway to the right. Izuku swiftly turned around and went down a side road to his left after catching a glimpse of his pursuer. He finally realized that he was traveling down a dead-end street with damaged buildings obstructing any further paths because of the poor visibility caused by the morning fog. But instead of pausing or going back the way he had come in search of a different path, Izuku ran steadily in the direction of the building that was approaching at the end of the road. As he approached, he made a sudden, superhuman leap through the air, landing momentarily atop a wrecked car that was in his path before skipping straight ahead to the top of a streetlight and then the building itself. Izuku skillfully landed 2 floors or so off the ground after sailing through the air in an arc and using his increased strength in conjunction with his hands and feet's spider-like adhesive ability to cling directly to the vertical surface. The boy didn't waste any time resting, though, and he used his new skills to scale the rest of the building. He slipped and stumbled a little bit a couple of times, but it didn't take him long to get all the way to the top of the building's facade. But just as he was about to scale the cliff, he heard footsteps far away but moving swiftly, and he turned to face the road below to see his pursuer coming through the mists, the outline of a long, thick tail swaying behind their body as they ran. Izuku swiftly threw himself onto the rooftop and ran directly across to the other side, where he leapt down onto the building next to it, not wanting to stay any longer than necessary. Using his superhuman leaping and climbing skills, he continued to move steadily across the uneven city rooftop terrain until he came to a point where the next rooftop in his line was across a street. Izuku swallowed uneasily, knowing that his assailant was surely getting closer by the moment, then ran up and leapt superhumanly toward the building in front of him, thrashing his arms wildly as he went. But despite everything the boy tried, his leap was too short to reach the opposing building's roof, and instead he slammed awkwardly against its facade a few floors too low. At least he was able to use his new quirk to successfully cling to the building's surface despite face planting into it. Izuku then swiftly continued climbing upwards after momentarily freeing a hand to tend to his sore and reddening nose. A shadow sprang from the roof behind him and landed right in his path, facing down toward the boy and clinging to the wall in a manner similar to his own, but before he could reach the top, a tingling sensation abruptly rang through his skull. The pursuer, now up close and personal, turned out to be what could only be described as a large, green lizard man dressed in clothes and a lab coat. His thick, forked tongue lolled out of his mouth, and his slit eyes and sharp teeth gleamed with a predatory light as he hissed and snarled menacingly. Hiss, ah! Izuku scrambled in surprise at the unexpected closeness, narrowly avoiding the lizard man's clawed hand as it swung out at him, but the boy lost his balance and his grip, falling backwards off the wall. In a panic, Izuku threw his arms in the direction of the building and let out 2 white streams from his wrists, which dispersed into several thin threads of spider-like webbing. The threads that made up one of the 2 web lines either broke or separated from the wall under the weight of the boy, causing him to spin uncontrollably and tangle himself in the loosened webbing as he continued to fall. Despite their successful attachment to the building, they were unable to stop his fall because the webbing was too weak. The boy screamed, "Yuwa," as he fell helplessly, screwing his eyes shut as the merciless ground came at him at a terrifying pace. He eventually stopped in the air a few feet off the ground, bouncing up and down a little for good measure as he dangled in place, but as he fell past the last floors, the still attached line of webbing began to stretch out like a rubber band, bleeding off his momentum. The boy sighed in relief at not hitting the ground head first, blinking owlishly with all 8 of his eyes, but he was still in danger, hanging upside down, entangled in his own web like a fish caught in a net. Indeed, He soon found himself facing the lizard man who had somehow descended onto the ground as well, possibly even before him, as he slowly spun around in place while trying to escape. Izuku winced and again screwed his eyes shut in terror as the lizard man hissed at him and then retreated, ready to swipe at him with his claws. However, the lizard man had torn through the webbing, not the boy, and instead of the long claws rendering his flesh, the boy felt the pain of the sidewalk suddenly rushing up to meet him. Reluctantly, Izuku looked up to see the lizard man take a more relaxed position while he retrieved a small black object from his lab coat while clutching his now sore head. "And time," the lizard man said sharply, turning off the digital stopwatch he was holding. "HMPH. Hardly your best performance, Midoriya." With a sad sigh, the boy's head drooped and he said, "I'm sorry, sensei." Since the primary goal of UA High was to train and educate future heroes, the school had a number of specialized facilities dispersed throughout the vast campus grounds. One such location was the Replica City District, which was, as the name suggests, a sizable, deserted city district built specifically for the students to train and experience what it's like to fight and use their quirks in a city setting. This would undoubtedly give them invaluable experience when they graduated and became official heroes. We shift our attention to the elegant glass building that stands conspicuously at the front of the campus grounds and serves as the main school building, while a mechanical gate in the large walls enclosing the replica city opened to allow a class of heroes in training, dressed in costume, to enter. We immediately proceed inside to the nurse's office, where a well-known face is politely going over Izuku. Hum. Good. As far as I can tell, aside from that big bruise on your face, you appear to be perfectly alright," said Dr. Shuazenji Chio, the little old doctor named the youthful heroine, recovery girl, who Izuku had gotten to know at the hospital, following a brief examination. "How'd you manage to get that anyway? Did you trip and faceplant onto the sidewalk perhaps?" Izuku scratched his chin sheepishly and acknowledged awkwardly, more like into the side of a building, actually. I tried to leap from one rooftop to another, and came up a little short." The small, elderly physician gave him a look. "A little short?" He acknowledged, 4 or 5 floors or so. "I was kinda, sorta, also jumping all the way across a highway street in the process." She sighed as she turned in her chair and began searching through her desk's drawers. "Good grief. You certainly waste no time trying to pull off some big shot moves," she said. "Your physical condition has only just recently recovered to the point where you've been declared fit to start undergoing physical training to familiarize yourself with your new abilities. And here you are, already leaping from rooftops like you're some kind of action man." She pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic and a wad of cotton, dipped the latter in the former, then turned back and gestured for Izuku to put his face forward. She then sighed lightly and acknowledged, "Well, I guess given your quirk, it's no wonder you'd end up trying to utilize high places." As she wiped over and around his red, swollen nose, Izuku muttered, trying not to wince, "Well, KHH I guess. While I recuperated in the hospital, I had a lot of time on my hands to at least get used to my new adhesion ability. Or rather, it was essential that I got used to it because I kept getting stuck to things all the time." Izuku thought briefly about how he would occasionally unintentionally pull his bedsheet, get his feet stuck on the floor, which would frequently lead to him tripping, or rip over furniture because he was unable to release his grip when he wanted to. He once stuck his 2 index fingers together for an entire afternoon, as though he were trapped in an invisible Chinese finger trap. And that didn't even include some of his more embarrassing incidents, such as the times he'd found it difficult to let go of particular body parts after using the restroom. "Izuku? Are you okay in there? Knock, knock." "No, Mom. Don't come in." Izuku shook his head, attempting to shake off those embarrassing memories. Anyway. I can freely control the adhesion in both my hands and feet now. And once I'd gotten some of my strength back, I was simply akin to get out of that hospital room. Hey. I guess you could say I'd been cooped up so long that I'd started climbing the walls." As soon as Dr. Shuazenji finished applying antiseptic to a fresh piece of cotton, Izuku's little smile at his foolish little joke turned to a grimace. "Yes. And I'm still annoyed that you started practicing like that without proper supervision," she abruptly stated, possibly exerting a bit more pressure than was absolutely required. The boy made a feeble attempt to defend himself by saying, I was pretty careful though, not moving to the ceiling until I'd gotten the hang of clinging to the walls successfully. I only really fell that one time because you suddenly came into my room and immediately started shouting ow." Dr. Shuazenji snorted in frustration. "And thank goodness you at least partially managed to bounce off the bed on your way down," he said. "If you'd fallen on your head in your brittle state at the time, it probably wouldn't have been as funny." Yes, I know. I'm deeply sorry. The doctor let out a slightly more relaxed sigh, seeing that the boy was sufficiently frightened. She threw the cotton wad in the trash can next to her desk and began searching through her drawers once more. Sheesh. Kids are always the same. Once they get their quirks, they can't help themselves but run a little wild with them, she said. But at least your resilience have now improved to the point that even crashing face first into a building facade only leaves you with a bruise or two. And while your physical condition continues to improve, you'll only keep on getting stronger. I won't be surprised at all if you'd be able to make that jump properly in a few weeks' time from now. Izuku pursed his lips as though he wasn't sure how to respond to someone giving him good feedback, but in the end he just looked down and nodded shyly. Izuku winced as the little old doctor applied a thick bandage across the bridge of his nose and then gave it a little tap just for good measure. There. That should do it, she said. Judging by your usual rate of recovery, I'd reckon the swelling should have passed after little more than a day or two. Izuku looked back up to make a curt bow to the woman sitting in front of him after carefully nursing the aggravated sore spot from his earlier faceplant with his fingers. Thank you, Dr. Shuazenji, for always looking after me like this. She waved him away, saying, don't think about it. This is my job after all, and then gave him a piece of candy from a Pez dispenser. Also, while we're on campus, please feel free to address me by my hero name, Recovery Girl. Like all the other students. The little old doctor gave Izuku a friendly laugh when he bowed his head and smiled hesitantly, saying, why yes. Thank you, Recovery Girl. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, Recovery Girl. The boy is not a student here yet. The two turned to where the lizard man had been waiting, leaning against a wall, when they heard the low, guttural voice. This man was Hidokage Karuto, hero name, Professor Lizard, who possessed a mutant-type quirk that gave him the abilities and the obvious appearance of a lizard. He worked at UA and held doctorates in biology and biochemistry. As a science instructor at the school, he was thought to be the best person to supervise the creation and training of Izuku's new quirk while the boy recovered on campus because of his combination of academic and athletic skills. But the man's blunt and distant manner suggested that he might not be particularly excited about this assignment. HMH. It was just a turn of phrase, Professor. There's no need to be so uptight about something so trivial, returned Recovery Girl, frowning lightly behind her visor. Besides, you know as well as I do that the boy wants to eventually enroll here. With only a sneer, the lizard man pushed himself off the wall and began to approach them, his thick tail swaying behind him. His piercing eyes moved to look directly at Izuku as he spoke. I respectfully disagree. I think it's important to firmly establish some boundaries, lest the boy forget his position here. And that is as a patient, not a student. He should focus on completing his therapy and rehabilitation to be able to live a normal life with his new abilities before entertaining such lofty aspirations like becoming a hero, of all things. Izuku looked down at the declaration, looking a little pale, but Recovery Girl was not having any of it. What's with that attitude? There's no need to be so dismissive of the boy's dreams like that. Besides, you're the one who's supposed to get the boy ready for his potential enrollment. Everything else is arbitrary, he said definitively before turning to face the doorway. My job, Recovery Girl, is to study the idiosyncrasies of the boy's unorthodox quirk and teach him to properly control it so he won't possess a danger to himself or others. HMPH. If we're done here, then it's time we got going already. Come on, boy. Let's not keep her waiting more than we already have, alright? Izuku squeaked, yes, I'm coming, as he leapt from his chair and started to follow, stopping only to turn around and give Recovery Girl one last bow. He called, Hidokage-sensei, wait up, as he rushed out of the nurse's office and followed the reptilian teacher down the hallway. Recovery Girl swiveled the chair she was sitting in to face her desk, muttering to herself as his rushed footsteps faded into the distance. Good grief. She moaned as she spoke. What's crawled up his scaly behind all of a sudden? As they left the main building and proceeded down one of the numerous paths that connected the various facilities through the campus grounds, which resembled a park, Izuku trotted after the man and dutifully followed along. Izuku silently observed his surroundings and the different UA as the broad path in front of them was bordered by beautiful tree sections that were well organized. They picked absently at the stray webbing strands that were still clinging to pieces of his tracksuit as they passed students on their way. He walked silently for a few minutes before the lizard man in front of him finally said something. Without turning around, he remarked, you know, by my estimate, you should have been able to make that kind of jump easily. In reference to Izuku's unsuccessful rooftop jump in the replica city district. Izuku Izuku stumbled, shocked to be called upon out of the blue. The professor went on to say, but you hesitated and subconsciously held back, severely limiting your performance, and it's not just when atop a daunting rooftop like earlier. You still think too much about your actions before performing them. You need to learn how to rely on your instincts. To rely on your quirk and its abilities better, until it becomes like a second nature. Just like how it is for everyone else who's grown up with their quirks. Izuku's forehead wrinkled slightly as he listened intently. But that's just it, isn't it? I haven't grown up with mine, he protested glumly. You can't expect me to make up for that difference in such a short time frame already. Professor Lizard closed his eyes, snorted lightly, and finally looked back through the corner of his eye to see the boy behind him staring back with a rare look of defiance on his face. And therein lies the problem, doesn't it? What are you? Midoriya, he interrupted again, turning to speak to the boy in a proper manner. Even among hero schools, UA High is an academy that sports a significantly intense curriculum. As such, they can only afford to accept the most promising of students, all of which having already spent years honing their individual abilities. He began to loom over the boy as he spoke, and Izuku nearly retreated from the man's overwhelming pressure. And considering your circumstances, surely you can understand my reluctance to entertain your notion of applying for UA, despite the principal's blessings. Especially for as preposterously soon as the next semester already. Don't go putting the cart before the horse, boy. Then, in a slightly softer voice, the man stepped back and pulled at the front of his lab coat to straighten it out. Once we've completed your therapy, only then can we talk about whether achieving your dreams is feasible or not. But until such a time comes to pass, you're best served focusing on the here and now. The professor turned back to face the front and proceeded along the path, his thick tail slightly swaying behind him from under his lab coat. Knowing that the man's reasoning had made perfect sense, Izuku clenched his fist tightly where he stood and cursed his own incapacity to respond. However, even so, shortly afterward, Izuku trailed behind Professor Lizard into what was then the school's sciences lab building. The two proceeded down a hallway past several security locks and guards, then opened one of the numerous doors to enter a respectably sized laboratory. The only person in the room got up from where she had been using a high-spec microscope to greet them calmly as they entered. This woman had a white lab coat over her clothes, just like Professor Lizard, but that was not the only similarity. This woman was what could only be called a humanoid reptile, and she had her own mutant-type quirk. Her features, however, were a little smoother and softer, and she clearly lacked the protective scales that the man wore on his body. It was probably more accurate to describe her as an amphibian than a reptile. Specifically, a salamander, whose smooth, purplish-black hide is sporadically speckled with yellow. She and the professor took each other's hands and rubbed their snouts together in greeting. "Welcome back, darling," she said. "Are you two done with the exercise?" "Yes, my love," said Professor Lizard in a tone of voice that was unexpectedly loving. "I'm planning to study the boys' telemetry readings from today's stress test, so would you mind taking over from here?" She said, "Not at all," and then she turned to face Izuku. "Midoriya-kun, just give me a moment to put away my work and we'll head downstairs to start today's session, alright?" Izuku nodded slightly and smiled at the salamander woman. "Why yes, sensei. I'm ready whenever you are." The woman closed her eyes and smiled amiably at the shy boy's sincere expression. Back at the hospital a while ago, as the doctors applied tiny adhesive patches with telemetric sensors to her son's forehead, a concerned Midoriya Inko asked, "Does he really have to do this? You saw what happened to him the last time he went outside. Aren't the tests you've already performed in here enough?" Dr. Shuazenji replied, "I understand your concerns, Midoriya-san. But that's exactly why we need this data so we can understand how to treat it, while tinkering with a tablet computer. Do not worry though. That choker we've also equipped him with is a medical tool that directly monitors his pulse, body temperature and other vital systems, so we'll be warned straight away if any crucial abnormalities occurs." The worried mother trailed off, wringing her hands, "Even if you say so." Her son interrupted to point out the young patient with the shaggy hair sitting on the hospital bed. "It's okay, Mom," he said. "If we don't find a way to get through this, then there's no way that I'll ever be able to become a hero, after all." Even though the boy's chin was sunken in and he still had dark bags under his eyes from spending months in his cocoon, his eyes had a clear, firm expression that demonstrated how strongly he believed what he was saying. "Izuku. Good grief," the elderly woman said with a friendly sigh and a headshake. "Looks like the boy is determined to do this at all costs." Dr. Shuazenji glanced back up at the boy sitting in front of her as her digital touchscreen began to show graphs such as the boy's heart rate and brainwave telemetries. Alright, the systems are now all set. Are you ready to begin, youngster? As ready as I'll ever be, I guess, he swallowed shyly in response. Shortly afterward, Izuku was making his way down the corridors that led from his room in the hospital's high-security wing, with his mother, recovery girl, and a few other medical professionals and orderlies trailing him from a distance. One of the doctors remarked, "It seems to be going well so far," as they observed the boy moving through the comparatively silent hallways, being extremely cautious to avoid bumping into anyone. Yes. Dr. Shuazenji muttered indifferently, continuing to watch the telemetry on the tablet, especially the way some of the graphs would slightly rise whenever the boy was near another person. However, it's from here on out that the test will start for real. With her eyes fixed on her son's back, the little old woman's words caused Inko to swallow hard. Izuku's journey finally led him out of the wing and into the main building, where he became increasingly tense due to the sudden and significant increase in activity around him. The buzzing sensation in his skull intensified as he became acutely aware of every single presence around him, whether or not they were in his line of sight. This was true for every single person he encountered in the hallway, whether they were doctors and nurses rushing about their business or even just indolent patients shuffling their way past. And the more he continued, the worse it got. His calmness wavered due to this tense, crowded feeling, so he carefully centered himself against the wall of the hallway, resting on his right forearm as he tried to regain control of his accelerated breathing. Sweat was now visibly streaming down the side of his face. It is taking place. He recalled the last time he had entered a very crowded section of the hospital and thought, just like last time. It was all he could do to keep the assault on his senses from overwhelming him, even though he had been anticipating it this time. Izuku. Inko whimpered anxiously from a distance at the condition her son had descended into, but recovery girl's piercing gaze stopped her from approaching him. Izuku swallowed and forced himself to keep moving forward after what felt like an eternity but might have only been a minute or two. He kept steadying himself against the wall and dragged his feet behind him. Izuku gritted his teeth in effort and eventually reached the end of a hallway that opened into a spacious area that was the hospital's entrance foyer. And if the hallways had been unpleasant, what was in front of him was now far worse. There was movement of some sort everywhere he looked, with people pacing in all directions in a never-ending, smooth, chaotic stream. Even though he was sweating profusely and his breathing had accelerated significantly, he forced himself to leave the threshold and stumbled into the actual room, taking slow, deliberate steps as though his feet were made of lead. The buzzing in his skull grew more and more intolerable the farther he ventured into the room, until he was unable to even hear his own thoughts. Inexplicably, he was still conscious of every single person moving around the room and every movement they made, even when he closed his eyes and cradled his trembling arms around himself. Every movement of their limbs, every rustle of their clothes, every step they took across the floor of hell, even the people behind the counters or just sitting in the waiting area, all of their presence simultaneously reverberated inside his skull, down to their heartbeats. And it was everything, just as well, a lot. He turned around just in time to witness a nurse who had been rushing across the room with a medical trolley unintentionally bump one of the wheels against an obstruction, knocking some of its contents onto the floor, after a specific sensation among the buzzing in his head caused him to do so. Izuku felt every tiny impact against the floor as if it were all happening in slow motion, as different tools and the medicine canister fell and spilled outwards. With a long, strangled whimper, the heavily perspiring boy raised his trembling hands to clutch at his head as others approached to assist the agitated nurse in gathering up her belongings. Inko was crying uncontrollably as she watched her son slowly fall to his knees in the center of the floor, joined by the other observers who were still at the end of the hallway. She lost control of herself and rushed in his direction, disregarding the instructions. Izuku, as he tried to stop her, one of the doctors exclaimed, wait, but recovery girl's cane blocked his path. Recovery girl calmly told them, "No, it's okay. We've pushed this as far as we should," as she lowered her cane back to the floor and looked back at the kneeling boy who was being cautiously approached by worried bystanders until his mother frantically closed the distance and gave him a huge hug. "Now hurry up and administer the poor boy a sedative already before you help his mother get him back to his room." Yes, Dr. Shuazenji, said the others. "We'll do so at once." The group had regrouped in Izuku's room to discuss their findings quite some time later. As she sat at the hospital bed, comfortingly holding her son, Inko asked, What did you call it, again?" A psychic perception field." The boy still appeared completely exhausted from the earlier experience, even after the sedatives and cold compresses had been given to him. Nevertheless, it was evident from his eyes that he was also paying close attention to the current discussion, even with his condition. Dr. Shuazenji nodded in answer to the mother's query before going on to inform the two of their findings. Yes. As we suspected from the initial incident and the subsequent tests we ran, young Midoriya is now capable of instinctively sensing his immediate surroundings via psychic perception. You can think of it like there is a constantly active radar inside of his head. Inko questioned, You mean like a bat's sonar? As two of the new doctors entered the room, a voice interrupted, saying, in this case, it would be more apt to compare it to a spider's web. You are. Inko said to the two, identifying them as someone she had seen in passing on multiple occasions when she had visited Izuku in the hospital. They both had mutant-type quirks that made them look very much like reptiles, though one had a shawl over their head. Dr. Shuazenji instructed her to point to the couple and said, Allow me to formally introduce them. These are the professors, Mr. Hidokage Karuto and his wife Maruza, who, like me, are employed at UA. There's someone I've been consulting with a lot regarding young Izuku's case ever since the original mall incident. The mother said, I see, and then gave the two a nod. You have my gratitude. The female professor said reassuringly, Don't think about it, as she removed the shawl she was wearing from her lower face with a gloved hand, exposing a black amphibian snout with large yellow markings. We're just happy we were able to contribute, both for Recovery Girl and your son's sake. Dr. Shuazenji turned back to the male professor who had spoken first, but the two women nodded to one another. And what did you mean by what you said earlier about the boy's ability? The man who looked like a lizard replied, It's quite simple, Recovery Girl, and began to go into further detail. According to the data you provided, it is like the boy has countless psychic feelers extending in all directions which instantly pick up and report information from the surroundings back to the center. Just like how a spider sitting in the middle of its web receives information from vibrations going down its threads. Somehow, the boy's mutation has granted him a passive psychic ability that seems to mimic this particular function. Izuku sat in his mother's arms, unable to do more than blink as he took in the news. The comparison made a lot of sense when you think about it. As she spoke to the two people on the bed, the female professor interrupted, saying, The problem, however, is that it's exactly that, a passive ability. Not only can it not be turned off at will, but it's also manifested extremely powerfully right from the onset, leaving the boy unable to cope as he haven't had the chance to develop the necessary affinity to filter out all the excess information. This is why, when there's too much activity around him to take in at once, your son suffers from extreme sensory overload like in the test you performed earlier. Izuku reflected on the overwhelming pressure and anxiety he had experienced earlier and the migraines he had been experiencing as a result, and thought that was one way to put it. His brain's nerves had seemed to have been ripped apart and tugged like strings in all directions. Inko inquired anxiously, then, can it be treated somehow? The lizard man said, There are a few ways that we could go about it. For one thing, there are medicines that can suppress a person's quirk. Unfortunately, they would serve to mute all his abilities, so. As Inko felt her son tense in her arms, she asked worriedly, Izuku? The boy muttered feebly, no way. As he attempted to lean forward and face the doctors appropriately. I've gone my whole life wishing to get a quirk. And now that I actually have one, I'll have to take medicines to suppress it. No. He raised his eyebrows. No, I don't want that. The lizard man looked up at him defiantly as he said that, and the two stared at each other in silence for a few seconds before the man closed his eyes and sighed in mild annoyance. As I was going to say, if you had let Met finish, he began, going with this approach as a poor long-term solution exactly for those reasons. The female professor took over as he blinked up at the man. We would instead suggest using a specially designed drug that will only suppress that particular ability, at least to a level where you feel you can handle it. As the goal here is to help you be able to live a normal life with your new quirk, we will see if we can gradually lower the dosage over time as you slowly become more and more accustomed to your psychic perception. Your spider sense, if you will, she stated, using her husband's metaphor. Naturally, we'd be running this parallel with teaching the boy cope with his physical abilities as well, said the male instructor. Then Inko said, I'm sorry. Are you saying you two will be the ones to personally oversee his therapy? Between the sciences involved, as well as the nature of young Midoriya's quirk, I can assure you that these two should be perfectly suited to the task, Dr. Shuazenji said with a knowing nod. And as I will be closely monitoring his health as well, between the three of us, your son will be in good hands at UA. Thank you so much, Inko said with gratitude as she assisted her weary son in bowing forward. We are forever in your debt. It's fine. It's fine. Smiled Dr. Shuazenji and waved it away. We've already promised to help the boy after all to repay his heroic actions. The lizard man said matter-of-factly, it's a personal request from Recovery Girl, as well as the principal. It's not like we could refuse, as his wife smiled at the boy in a small but comforting way. Today, UA campus. Izuku stood in the middle of an open room, wearing his tracksuit without the jacket, casually adjusting the now visible telemetry choker around his neck before blindfolding himself by tying a large handkerchief around the top half of his face, making sure to cover the extra eyes on his forehead as well. He spread his stance slightly by lowering his bare arms to his sides, and then he did a breathing exercise to center himself. He inhaled through his nose, then exhaled deeply from his mouth a moment later. When he finished, the boy nodded and the female Professor Hidokage's voice called out from the side of the room, "Are you ready now, Midoriya-kun?" "Yeah. We can begin whenever, sensei." "Okay then. Let's start gradually as usual." A number of drones that resembled tennis ball pitching machines were positioned around the edge of the large room, all of them pointed in the direction of the center, where the boy in the blindfold was waiting. The salamander woman stood with her tablet, controlling them remotely, and pressed the touchscreen to turn them all on, the constant hum of the machine's engines echoing through the room. She then had one of the machines shoot a single tennis ball from one of the room's corners after a few seconds, which made the boy turn involuntarily to face it, and then take a direct hit that bounced off his nose, which was already bruised, and get conked. "Gah!" The professor approached the boy, who was now sitting in a crouch on the floor and hissing in pain while nursing his sore spot over the band-aid, and said, "Ah. Oh dear. Are you okay, Midoriya-kun?" With her long tail swaying behind her. "Why yeah," he mumbled, his teeth clenched. Just give me a second." After a little while, the boy had regained his composure and was standing in front of the salamander woman, looking up at her with the handkerchief held slightly up. Using the same term she had created back at the hospital for his psychic perception field, she dragged her gloved fingers across the tablet and said to him analytically, "Okay. That one seemed to be a failure because you reacted to the sound of the ball being fired, and not to your spider sense. Try to center yourself again, Midoriya-kun, and then we'll restart the test." UUHN. In response to the boy's excessively rigid nod, the female professor's clinical and icy face slightly softened in laughter before she cautiously reached over and, after a brief moment of hesitation, put her gloved hand on his shoulder. She said, smiling slightly, "Try to relax a little more, Midoriya-kun," as she carefully knelt down to eye level, making the bashful boy sway back a little in place from the somewhat intimate position. "Just block everything else out and try to think of nothing at all. Do you think you can do that?" He shook off his blush and nodded intently. "NNH. Okay," he said. "I'll try my best." "Good," she said, nodding and grinning slightly before getting back up. "Then let's continue, shall we?" Izuku pulled the handkerchief back over his eyes and resumed his breathing exercises as she walked back outside the circle of tennis ball pitchers. He did them for a little longer than the last time, until they eventually slowed down to his normal breathing. The boy could hear nothing but his own quiet breathing and the humming of the various machines that surrounded the room in complete darkness. The professor pressed on her tablet and launched a single tennis ball again, from a different angle, after noticing that the boy was finally at ease. A slight buzzing sensation in his skull caused him to suddenly crane his neck sideways as the ball sped toward the still boy, allowing it to pass him and bounce harmlessly across the floor on the opposite side of the room. As the boy returned to his position, the professor nodded in agreement with the outcome and proceeded to launch tennis balls from 3 machines in quick succession, each from a different angle. Izuku instinctively half-turned in place to avoid the first ball, then tilted his torso forward and backward to avoid the other 2 as the tingling sensation returned to his skull. The salamander woman adjusted the settings on her tablet, and as the balls bounced across the floor, all the machines began to pitch tennis balls at random. It began slowly and gradually, but soon there were tennis balls flying simultaneously from all directions toward the center of the room. Izuku continued to dodge and weave with surprisingly elegant movements throughout it all, relying on his spider sense to guide him through the onslaught without taking any hits. Izuku's movements became increasingly acrobatic as the salamander woman slowly raised a colored bar on her touchscreen to symbolize the intensity of the bombardment. The movements flowed naturally from ducks and rolls into jumps and leaps, as well as backflips, forward flips, and twirling handstands, creating a captivating performance that could have easily outperformed an Olympic gymnast. When the pitching machines finally ran out of ammunition, the barrage began to taper off after dancing for a while like a leaf in a hailstorm. A panting Izuku tried to steady his breathing while standing erect in the center of the room with dozens of tennis balls strewn all over the floor. He also dragged his bare forearm under his jaw to wipe away the perspiration from the effort. But as things were starting to calm down, the salamander woman grinned and hit her tablet once more, causing one of the pitching machines to throw one last ball that it had been holding onto. The boy turned abruptly and just caught it in his hand before it could hit him, which made her smile even bigger. As the weary boy threw away the ball and took the handkerchief off his head, she cheered, "Great job, Midoriya-kun. You finally made it through the whole barrage. Starting tomorrow, we'll be able to raise the difficulty level again." Izuku replied wearily, "Huff. Huff. Hey. Please give me a break, sensei." But his broad smile belied his perspiration-streaked face, which showed that he was quite proud of his accomplishment. The professor chuckled lightly at his response and then launched another app on her tablet, which caused the ball pitching machines to begin moving across the room by themselves. They continued to droning in a mechanical tone while sucking back up the tennis balls that had been scattered. As they milled about like giant Roombas, they buzzed in unison, "Cleaning. Cleaning." One of the machines responded in a sing-song voice, "I know." She called, "Well then, Midoriya-kun, you must be parched," and then she pointed to the sports bottle beside the boy's jacket on the wall behind her. "Come get something to drink already. Then, once you're done in the showers, we'll head over to the cafeteria for some lunch, okay?" Huff. Huff. "Ah, yeah. That sounds great," the perspiring boy replied with a smile. But just as he was about to approach her, he stepped on one of the tennis balls that were still lying around the floor by mistake and fell back over, hitting the back of his head against the floor. He was too tired to notice the tingling in his skull again. Ooh-ah. Clonk. Gawk. As the groaning boy writhed back and forth on the floor, clutching at the back of his sore head, the woman called over in concern, "Ah. Midoriya-kun. Are you alright?" A humorous sweat drop appeared on the back of her head. The aptly named Grand Mess Hall was a massive, yet exquisitely designed school cafeteria that could seat hundreds of people. It was built not only to house UA's hero course but also all of the students from the school's other courses. But since it was after lunch, there weren't many students there when they got there, so Izuku and the professor were able to find a table for themselves after receiving their meals from the chef-like pro hero behind the kitchen counter. "Ah. The cooking hero, Lunch Rush's cooking is great as always," Izuku hummed appreciatively while using chopsticks to eat from a bowl. Getting to eat food this delicious every day for such affordable prices, and that's been prepared by a pro hero no less. Man, UA students are so lucky. The salamander woman smirked as she sat across from him, eating and looking over and marking some schoolwork at the same time. Yes, indeed," she said. As UA's curriculum can be quite demanding, providing the students with a reprieve such as a fulfilling meal does wonders to recharge their batteries and revitalize their spirits. "I can imagine," Izuku said, nodding to himself before contentedly consuming a few more bites of his food. It was pure joy to be able to eat cooking like this with the appetite he had developed from his previous workouts. They continued to eat in silence so that the teacher could concentrate on her work, but occasionally a student would pass by and wave and greet the female professor. The professor would respond politely before turning back to the papers on the table. After a few instances of this, she looked up to see Izuku looking thoughtfully after the final two students who had passed, with an expression on his face that she couldn't quite read. The mop-haired boy was startled out of his reverie when she finally said, "There. I've finished grading your homework," setting aside her marker and stacking the papers. "As always, you've performed quite exceptionally, Midoriya-kun." As he was handed the papers across the table, the boy blushed slightly at the compliment. "Ah, thank you. Since I ended up with a lot of free time back at the hospital, I started hitting the books as quickly as I was able to in order to not fall behind any further," he said. "It took some effort though, as in the beginning I could hardly turn the pages in them without getting my fingers stuck due to my new quirk." She rearranged her food in front of her with a friendly smile. "Hee. Well, the effort you've put in shows," she said. "At this rate, you'll be all caught up with your old class in no time at all." Thanks," he said with an uneasy smile. He chuckled softly and nervously scratched a finger over the band-aid that was resting on the ridge of his nose. Growing up, being good at studying was one of the few, if only talent I've ever had, to be honest," he said. Izuku missed her disapproving glance at his rather self-deprecating remark because he had already contentedly begun reviewing the professor's grading of his papers. She murmured in a low, unreadable voice, "I see," and then silently went back to eating. "Well anyway, I'm sorry for having to cut into your lunch break again to go over your homework." The boy flustered, no goodness, no, don't apologize. In response, you and your husband are already doing so much for my sake. And not only are you two and recovery girl constantly looking after my health as you help me get used to and train my quirk, but you're even helping me catch up with my middle school education. All the while tending to your proper jobs as teachers at this school as well, he murmured. He emphasized, I can't even begin to describe how thankful I am to you. To all of you, bearing in mind All Might and the principal. He smiled amusedly at the salamander woman in the lab coat. She told him, no need to be so flustered, Midoriya-kun. This is all part of the responsibilities that come with our jobs, after all, which caused the boy to stammer once more as she explained that what they were doing for him went far beyond what she had chosen to stop at the first sign. She interrupted his convoluted speech with a matter-of-fact question. Speaking of your health, you haven't been getting any more of your migraines lately, have you? A hesitant, no, I haven't, was his response. Not since the last time we adjusted the amount of the medicine you've assigned me. That's good to hear, she said reflectively. She indicated the black choker peeking up under the boy's shirt collar with her chopsticks before using them to take another bite out of her food. The recent telemetry readings from the medical choker you're wearing support the fact that your brain levels have indeed finally stabilized, she said. Then she raised an eyebrow and looked at him. But nevertheless, if your spider sense starts giving you trouble again, then you absolutely need to inform us, alright? He honestly replied, It's fine, moved by her worry. As you know, if it isn't something that I somehow instinctively perceive as a threat, or at least something alarming, then my spider sense usually doesn't react to anything outside my close, immediate vicinity, he said. Like, I can still sense whatever and whoever is really close by, which makes me get a little anxious if I'm in the middle of a really dense crowd and stuff, but... The boy stumbled over his words and paused in his agitated tirade. He went on, speaking softer, but if I had to characterize it, I would say that it's not quite as deafening anymore. The professor leaned back in her chair and gave herself a wise nod at the boy's silent declaration. She remarked, Good. It's a relief that we seem to have finally narrowed down your medication to the correct dosage. This should help give you a better chance to get accustomed to your new ability without becoming overwhelmed by it, before frustratingly dragging a hand over the shawl on her head. But I must say, it is really a peculiar ability, even given your quirk's circumstances. While I fully understand that he had no choice at the time, it is somewhat a shame there was no way for All Might to salvage the spider that caused your mutation in the first place. Not only was it a unique specimen, but if we could have studied it in a controlled environment, it might have provided us some insight into how to deal with your case as well. Izuku blinked. You think that my spider sense might have not have been just a freak mutation, but an ability it had originally possessed as well? There's no way to tell at this point, that's the problem, she replied. There was hardly any of its brain left after All Might had finished it off, after all. But we cannot deny either possibility. Izuku held up and examined one of his own hands before responding, I see. Until we got it under control with the pills I'm now taking every day, I had somewhat started to believe that my spider sense was some sort of repercussion or penalty for finally getting a quirk of my own. He thought, furrowing his brows. Like I couldn't get anything right in my life without there being some sort of catch to it. The Deku that I've always been, that is. The professor sighed when he saw how the boy was now clenching his trembling fist. You shouldn't think like that, Midoriya-kun. A smart boy like you with such an analytical mind when it comes to quirks must have noticed that our powers often come with their fair share of drawbacks as well that we must learn to live with. Trust me, I know that to be a fact from very personal experience. The boy's shaggy hair hung over his face, and he blinked as he looked up at her. Like you know, both my husband and I possess mutant-type quirks related to cold-blooded creatures, which you might have guessed makes our bodies more susceptible to things like extreme temperatures than your average person. She started to explain. But while this means people like us have to take some extra care with either staying warm or staying hydrated during the different seasons of this country, that's not where the main problem with my own particular quirk lies. Are you perhaps referring to your toxins, sensei? Yes, she said in a somewhat muted tone as she gently pulled back one of her lab coat sleeves to demonstrate how long her gloves were. Izuku would probably not be shocked to hear that they went nearly all the way past her biceps, even though he couldn't see where it ended. She gestured to the yellow markings on her face that were not yet hidden by her shawl. You see, I don't only have the physical attributes of a salamander, but those resembling a fire salamander at that. With all that entails, unfortunately, she said. I was born with poison glands located all over my body. And as I grew older, my toxins grew in potency as well. leading to several instances where I would accidentally poison and incapacitate my classmates from but the slightest touch. Izuku listened intently as he processed what she had said. At last, he said, "That must have been hard." "It was," she said, nodding, her eyes briefly glazed over as she probably recalled something before jolting herself to reality. I've since learned to properly control this aspect of my quirk, of course, including just how powerful and debilitating my toxins are when I actually need to use them. In fact, I haven't had an accident like that occur ever since high school," she said with a smile before becoming more pensive. "But despite that, the fear that a single moment of carelessness could cause something like that to happen again is still engraved in my body. Especially with how potent my toxins have the potential to be. Which is why I so often try to avoid physical contact with others," she said with a solemn laugh. "Hey. You must think it's silly, right? Despite having long since mastered my quirk, I'm still constantly wearing all this protective clothing from top to tail just because I can't shake this trauma of mine." Izuku honestly responded, No, I don't think it's silly at all, since it wasn't. I think you're a really strong person, sensei. Both for dealing with such problems, as well as telling me about them like that." "Thank you," she said quietly, giving him a small nod of appreciation. "You're a very kind child, Midoriya-kun." Before he realized what he was doing, the boy began to smile reluctantly. But wait. What about your husband? I've noticed that you don't seem to have any problems with touching him without wearing anything, and oh my gosh, that came out wrong." The professor, who had appeared a little dazed a moment before, now raised a hand to her mouth in laughter. With a raised eyebrow, she responded, "A very astute observation. I'd expect nothing less from you, Midoriya-kun," laughing at the red face the adolescent boy across the table had taken after his verbal blunder. "But as you can probably tell, my husband is the exception to the rule. Not only because of the bond we've built, but also because that man has deliberately made a great effort over the years to build up a resistance to my toxins, just to help set me more at ease with him and alleviate some of my anxieties." Izuku blinked in surprise. "Wow. In all honesty," he acknowledged, that's really kind of him." "Yes. He is," she said, folding her hands and fondly glancing down at her wedding ring beneath her glove. Then she fixed the boy with a serious look. "Anyway, the point I was getting at was that I hope you'll understand the importance of being open with us about your own condition in turn," she said. "Don't forget that, like the rest of your abilities, your spider sense is likely still developing. Therefore, you'll absolutely have to alert us if you start feeling any changes. I don't want you to try to hide it and toughen it out on your own again the way you've already shown that you're prone to do." With a guilty squirm, the boy's eyes strayed to the table. He whispered shyly, I just don't want to bother or worry people needlessly, that's all. It might have passed on its own if I'd only waited a little longer." While not wanting to cause a big fuss about oneself might be an admirable quality in certain circumstances perhaps, I assure you that it's quite counterproductive when your health is concerned, she said with great seriousness. As we're not only your teachers, but also your doctors, your tendency to push yourself in secret only serves to make our work harder, do you understand? "Yes, I understand," he said with a feeble nod and a forward head tilt. I'm sorry." She nodded with her arms crossed and then let out a kind sigh. "Good. I know it's not always easy to be so open with others with such matters, especially for a boy of your age, but I want you to be assured that we only want what's best for you," she said. "You know, I first thought your mother was exaggerating when she warned us about that trait of yours, but Recovery Girl was quick to back up that statement, as well as going at length about your unsupervised escapades testing your quirk while you were still in the hospital. I understand that you wish to be ready before the next semester, but you mustn't push yourself too hard too soon or it will only hurt you in the long run. Speaking of your mother, will she be visiting again to make dinner for you at the usual time?" Izuku's head shot up at the abrupt shift in subject, trying to think of a suitable answer. He paused for a moment before answering, "Why yes. She will. We texted a little earlier about it. She also told me to let you know that she would really like it if you and your husband were able to join us again today," he timidly replied. That is, if you're available of course." She closed her eyes and smiled approvingly. "Oh, we'd be delighted. I'll make sure we'll set aside some time so we can join you," to which the boy grinned back. He explained cheerfully, Really? That's great, she's really been looking forward to spending another evening talking with you and Hitokage-sensei both," before he blinked when he realized something. I mean, not you, Hitokage-sensei well, obviously you too. She really enjoys your company but also the other Hitokage-sensei. That is, your husband, the professor." "Oh, not that you aren't a professor too, I mean." He quickly raised his hands to assure her, I know you both have PhDs. I was just, The salamander woman sitting across from him began giggling into her hand, which stopped his nervous, rambling speech. She amusedly reassured him, Ufufu. Calm down, Midoriya-kun. There's no need to be so anxious with me. I know perfectly well what you meant, which made the tense boy blush as he looked down. And you should just do as the students and refer to us by our hero names from here on, she said. It gets less confusing that way. He responded, feeling a little dejected. Yes, Hidokage I mean, Professor Fire Salamander, he said. As she calmly took another bite of her food, she said, just Salamander-sensei is fine. And then she looked away for a while, her face thoughtful. My husband will probably insist to return to his work in the lab immediately afterwards, but I'll make sure that he shows at least. No matter how absorbed he is in his work, even he needs to take breaks to eat. Whether he likes it or not. As he picked at his food, Izuku muttered, yeah, I understand. His work is important after all, which made the professor blink, noticing the strange mood the boy had taken on. Oh, please do not take it personal, Midoriya-kun. That's just the way it is with us scientists sometimes, I'm afraid. More often than not we'll have to prioritize our work over a steady eat and sleep cycle. He looked up, blinking in bewilderment at what she had said. What? He reassured her, oh, no, it's not that. It's just, before slowly lowering his eyes once more. No, never mind, it's nothing. Her eyes narrowed as she said sharply, Midoriya-kun. What did I just say earlier about being forthcoming about your problems? This is different. It's not related with my health or anything like that. Even still, if there's something you're concerned about then I don't want you to feel afraid to discuss it with us. Health is about more than just your physical condition, you know? Under her patient gaze, he paused and eventually gave in. It's nothing important, it's just. I was just reminded of something Hidokage I mean, Lizard Sensei, told me earlier today. How I should keep in mind that I'm a patient, and not a student, here. Oh. Izuku bit his lip tentatively, trying to decide whether or not to continue, looking sideways to avoid the woman's perplexed stare. Midoriya-kun. The boy swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts. Please don't take this the wrong way, because like I said earlier, I am really grateful to you for all that you and your husband are doing for me. His teeth clenched. It's just that. Yes. She gently nudged him. When we're out on campus, I always see how the UA students respond whenever they see you. They always call out to you and give you a short greeting, not just out of respect, but I can tell that the two of you are genuinely well liked by the student body. And you always respond friendly in turn, you and your husband both, but with me, your husband is always very terse and to the point. Completely professional at all times, while setting constant boundaries and remaining very standoffish. And I'm sorry, but despite everything, I can't help but think that. The boy took a quick breath and then nervously went on, his eyes darting back and forth to see how she was feeling. Does Lizard Sensei dislike me for some reason? After a few moments of silent staring, the professor tipped her head forward and gave it a slight shake. She whispered to herself, oh, dear. I should have anticipated this. Before turning back to face the actual boy. Her words, do not fret, Midoriya-kun, were consoling. My husband does not hate you. Far from it, in fact. It's just. She quietly recalled a previous conversation she'd had with her husband, and let out a soft but tired sigh. Rewind. The woman salamander strode over to her husband's seat and said, you've been hunkering down in your lab a lot lately, more so than usual, I mean. Well, we've had a lot of work to do, the lizard man said nonchalantly as he looked through an electronic probe. Especially with the new patient on our hands. Yes, but you've completely buried yourself in here. He said, I'm just trying to make sure there won't be any further complications down the road, that's all, as he turned in his chair and raised his head to display a computer screen with a magnified image of a cell sample. The Midoriya boy's mutation is quite extraordinary, he said. The way that his body have been rewritten on a genetic level to accommodate his new quirk. I am convinced that if not for the boy's DNA having effectively been a blank slate beforehand, then there is no way that he would have been able to adapt to the venom or survive the mutagenic process, he said, placing his hand on his jaw in the midst of his thoughts. It's a fortunate thing indeed that he was born quirkless. His wife made a face behind him, her mouth narrowing into a thin line. That may be so, but I wouldn't break it to him like that, she said. Midoriya-kun won't really say it outright, but it is clear that growing up without a quirk in today's society has been difficult for him. After a brief pause, the lizard man went back to his work on the computer in front of him. Yes. Taking his subdued and anxious nature into account, I suppose I could easily see that being the case. Professor Salamander tightened her jaw. She stepped up beside him and slapped a gloved hand down onto the table for emphasis, finally getting her husband to turn his head and look up at her. Yes. And it would have been apparent to you long ago if you weren't so busy hiding away from him all the time, she said. Whatever do you mean? He inquired, his reptilian, piercing eyes deliberately neutral. She spread her arms outward to point to the science lab building on campus, where they were now. Don't try to play ignorant, Karuto. Ever since the boy was transferred into our care here at UA, you've spent nearly all your free time cooped up inside your lab, interacting with Midoriya-kun only when necessary despite him currently living under our supervision in this very building, she said. And whenever you're directly overseeing his studies or training, you're making it quite clear that you're always keeping him at arm's length, refusing to open up to him in the slightest. And frankly, I want a straight answer as to why, she demanded, pointing the finger at him. You're clearly concerned about Midoriya-kun or his medical condition at the very least, so why do you keep pushing the boy himself away like that? This is not like you at all. The man shifted his seat away from the desk and raised his fingers to rub the ridge between his eyes as he looked up at the woman standing above him. I'm just trying to set some boundaries in an attempt to ensure that the boy doesn't get carried away too much with his aspirations to become a hero, he murmured. Trust me, it's for his own benefit. His wife raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms slowly. Explain? With a snort, the man got up from his chair and walked out onto the floor, pacing around a bit while gathering his thoughts, his lab coat and reptilian tail swaying behind him. As you know, he finally started as he halted with his back to her. I was immediately reluctant towards the principal's request regarding young Midoriya. Not to treat the boy, mind you, but the rest of it. This 14-year-old child has miraculously acquired a quirk after living his entire life without one, and they want us to now help him get ready to apply for UA's hero course with just a few measly months' worth of training and therapy? That's not only reckless, it's completely irresponsible, he said, turning to her and swiping his arm. Even overlooking the obvious problems, there's also how strong his particular quirk is to consider. Unlike with other children whose abilities are slowly developing over time after they've first manifested, his are maturing at a greatly accelerated pace. It is as if the quirk itself is rushing to catch up with the rest of his body's development, he speculated, gesticulating with his hands as he talked. He paced the floor again and exclaimed, and that's not even getting into his psychic perception ability. While in theory it would serve to provide young Midoriya with an unmatched spatial awareness in the field, it has manifested so powerfully straight from the onset that its effects are outright debilitating for the boy so much that he requires constant supervision and electronic monitoring when outside the laboratory in case he breaks down again from suffering a too powerful sensory overload. Professor Salamander took the initiative to address his worries. That's exactly why we'll be here at hand to guide Midoriya-kun and ensure that his control over his new abilities keep growing accordingly, at least till the development of his quirk starts leveling out, the female instructor passionately replied. She explained, as for his spider sense, we've been keeping a careful eye on his brain levels all this time to monitor just how it acts up in different situations, which is then taken into account when we assign the boy his dosages, before clenching her hands in front of her. We are so close to finding a level that keeps him stable, yet still capable of utilizing his spider sense, even under situations of great stress. The readings from the adrenaline tests we've been performing to help acclimate himself to his other abilities confirms this. But that is a temporary measure that will constantly need to be adjusted as both his spider sense and his other abilities continue growing, he said, turning back to face her. And even with the medicine's help, it might take years before he's capable of properly controlling it. Despite this, you're still willing to encourage him to apply for the hero course as soon as the next semester? He asked incredulously. His wife said, Karuto, in a pleading tone. If you'd gotten to know the boy properly, you would have realized that Midoriya-kun longs to become a hero almost desperately. So much that I wouldn't be surprised if he had attempted to try the UA entrance exam even without a quirk, as mad as that seems, she thought, shaking her head at the absurdity of this. And now that he finally has the proper opportunity, you're going to deny him that? He angrily retorted, if the stability of his condition can be assured, then yes. Before gathering himself and approaching to gently place his hands on her shoulders. He calmly explained, pressing his forehead against hers for a moment before he withdrew and started to return to his desk. Look. I have no plans of sabotaging the boy, but we can't allow ourselves to be swayed so much by sentiment that we ignore the facts before us, he said. Having waited this long to get a quirk, then the boy should be able to wait another year or two until we're certain that he's learned to properly control it before allowing him to officially apply for this school. And if social norms are too much of a concern for him to wait that long, then I understand he's already fully welcome in the non-hero courses where you won't have to rely on his quirk or risk his health. Professor Salamander watched him sit down in front of the computer again and said nothing. After saying calmly, "If the boy comes to hate me for this, then so be it. I am fully prepared to shoulder that burden," he turned to face her over his shoulder, his reptilian eye fixed firmly on her. "Nevertheless, I will not let him rush into this until I'm assured he's actually ready." Flashback ends. "My husband. Karuto," the professor said, choosing her words carefully. "Although he's a very kind man, he can also be very reserved at times. Sometimes by habit, and sometimes by choice." Izuku inquired anxiously, "You mean, did I do something?" "No, not directly, per se. It's just sometimes he feels it necessary to maintain an emotional distance from his work in order to not risk letting any personal bias interfere with its progress. And I'm sad to say that your case is one such occurrence," she said. "It's not that he has anything against you. It's just his awkward way to try to do right by you." She added inaudibly, "Making sure he's helping you in the ways he's concluded you need rather than in the ways you might necessarily prefer." After taking in what she had said, Izuku blinked before turning to face the table. "Then, isn't there anything I can do?" He looked up to see the woman across the table smile reassuringly at him as he felt a big gloved hand gently land on top of his own. "For now, just keep doing your best with your training and schoolwork while also keeping in mind not to push yourself recklessly," the instructor advised him. "As long as you make sure to faithfully follow our instructions while paying proper attention to your health, then I'm certain you will be able to win my husband over eventually, the same way you did Recovery Girl, the principal, and even the top hero All Might." And herself, she thought in private, "I know it's only a question of time, so hang in there, okay?" "Why yes, I understand," he nodded, holding up and pumping his fists in front of him as his mood clearly improved. I'll do my best." The female professor gave him a nod while grinning intently. At another local police station that day, a private office door was pushed open with such force and speed that it nearly came off its hinges. All Might proclaimed, "I have arrived," as he stood imposingly in the doorway, the window blinds on the door rattling. "Ah, All Might. How good to see you, please come in." Police Detective Tsukachi Naomasa, a well-groomed but ordinary, if not plain-looking, man with short black hair, squarish features, and a calm and amiable expression, was the one seated inside the room who had responded so casually despite the hero's opulent entrance. All Might said, "Ha ha. Don't mind if I do, old friend," and walked confidently over to sit in front of the man's desk after shutting the door behind him. "Now, about the things you wished to discuss with me." As he finished setting aside his papers and stood up, the man calmly said, Wait, before that." The detective turned back to the seated hero with a laid-back smile after going over and locking the door to his office and making sure the blinds on the door and the windows were correctly adjusted and closed. "We should be good now, so feel free to unflex while you're here, Toshinori." For a few seconds, the muscular and ever-grinning hero stared back in silence. Then, smoke erupted from and obscured his form, exposing the top hero's now deadly skeletal state whenever he shut down. As the other man went back to his desk, Yagi Toshinori sighed languidly and adjusted his now oversized uniform. Thank you, Tsukachi-kun," he said. "With how little time I can remain active as All Might these days, every little break I can spare helps." "Don't think about it, my friend. As you know, your secret's safe with me," the detective said, taking a seat across from him. "What's important is for you to conserve your strength for when it's actually needed, after all." Toshinori looked up to face the man in question after nodding in agreement and coughing lightly into his fist a few times. "Well then. You said the police had made some new findings that you wanted to discuss with me." The man said, "Why, yes," with a matter-of-fact nod. "While it's now been a couple of months since it took place, I'm certain even a busy hero such as yourself still remember the Berserker incident." Toshinori nodded gravely. "But of course. That was what the media dubbed the gas attack at that mall I did a public appearance in a while back," he said. "While it's quite a tacky naming sense, Berserker is indeed an effective and descriptive moniker for that heinous gas that was used." Tsukachi replied, "That's putting it mildly," while he flipped through some papers on his desk. "Once inhaled, it supercharges one's quirk factor to the point of going out of control while simultaneously making the victim lose their senses to uncontrollable aggression and paranoia. ultimately causing them to go on a violent and destructive rampage with their abilities. That is, as long as they possess a quirk. Toshinori muttered under his breath, though those who weren't naturally born with theirs might have a semblance of resistance to it seems. To a certain degree, at the very least. The man across the table nodded at him in agreement. Indeed. Though even after all this time, we have yet to untangle all the ins and outs of this mysterious gas aside from the fact that it appears to be man-made, and not the product of someone's quirk. Yes. I've had the opportunity to discuss the matter a few times with one of the hero community's leading toxicology experts. Sukachi interrupted, I take it you're talking about Hidokage Maruza, aka Professor Fire Salamander. Correct, Toshinori said with a nod. She and her husband, Professor Lizard, are still working on examining samples of the gas in their private labs at UA, and even esteemed scientists such as themselves are to this day still coming up short on determining just how exactly it is able to affect quirk wielders the way it does. The detective drew a palm across his forehead and leaned back in his chair, saying, I see. That's honestly quite disconcerting. The hero shook his head lightly and then looked back up. Even in this day and age, there are still many mysterious surrounding just how quirks work after all, he said. She confided in me this, however. In her own words, the person who designed this gas, whomever they may be, has to be an amazing genius, or completely insane. Or perhaps both. Sukachi scowled and said, HMPH. Well, I believe she might be quite right. As you know, the case has been considered a black mark to the authorities, as even after all this time, neither the police force nor the hero community have managed to uncover who was behind the attack in the first place. There's been no declaration or statement of intent from the guilty party, which is unusual following this sort of villain attack, leaving us no way to track them down or even hint at their identity, save a few dead-end leads. Indeed. But I assume this conversation of ours means that the situation has changed, huh, Sukachi-kun? You assume correctly, All Might, the detective acknowledged as he swiveled in his chair to retrieve a directory from his desk drawer. One such dead-end lead has finally resurfaced, you see. The hero sat up straight and waited patiently while the other man took out a photograph from the folder on his desk. Toshinori craned his neck forward as Detective Sukachi held it up in front of him and asked, Do you remember this man? Fukuyama Yuta? He was the owner of a small moving service that had been declared missing by his family just a few days before the attack took place. Ah, yes. He was deemed a person of interest in the quirk Berserker case due to the nature of his quirk, correct? Right, said the detective with a nod. Fukuyama-san's quirk allowed him to shrink non-living objects for a temporary period of time. Having attained a license to use it for his work, he utilized it for quick and easy transport of his client's property when moving things back and forth from his truck. However, despite possessing no real criminal record, the resemblance between the effects of his quirk and how those gas canisters suddenly appeared all over the mall during the attack made it a high possibility that he was somehow connected to this case. The furrows on Toshinori's forehead were furrowed. You keep talking about the man in the past tense. Does that mean? A somber? Yes, I'm afraid so, the detective said as he extracted another folder photo. We've located what we've identified to be Fukuyama-san's corpse. Toshinori grimaced a little as he looked at the picture that was now on the desk in front of him. He may have had a metaphorical iron stomach when it came to such issues because of the incredible amount of death and horror he had witnessed during his pro-hero career, but he still wasn't particularly fond of them. He exhaled, goodness, the state of the man, alluding to the twisted and rotten scene. Where did you find him? The detective spread similar pictures across his desk and said, he was one of nearly a dozen corpses recently discovered at a local landfill, having been buried deep beneath tons and tons of trash for several months already. While we have yet to identify all of the bodies we found after combing the place, we believe them to be related to the incident as well due to traces of the quirk Berserker gas detected in their remains. Many of them show signs of having fought one another to the death, and we believe a few of them even died from critical overuse of their own quirks, which can, depending on the nature of certain quirks, prove fatal. Toshinori's sunken eyes glowed with an electric blue light in their pupils. With disgust, he exclaimed, they were the villain's test subjects. Guinea pigs. The detective nodded and said, yes, we believe that to be the case as well, before pointing back to the original picture. However, while Fukuyama-san test results matches the signs of extreme quirk fatigue, there were no traces of the quirk Berserker gas in his systems. He instead tested positive for more common quirk-enhancing drugs, as well as several blunt force trauma injuries across his body that were received before death. All signs point towards that he was an unwilling pawn in the villain's scheme. targeted simply for the sake of his quirk and then coerced into aiding them before being subsequently disposed of. Toshinori gave a nod. It made sense. Cause of death? He appears to have been stabbed in the back and pierced clean through by a large and cylindrical metal object, going by the minute shavings found inside the wound. The damage doesn't seem to match up with any conventional weapons we know of, so we're currently looking into if a metal-related quirk could be involved or not. If that's the case, we might even get a lead to the culprit's identity by referencing it to the public quirk registry. The detective sighed as he gathered the photos and put them back in his folder. Yes, but truth be told, I doubt that it's going to be that easy, he said. Whoever this villain is, they've gone to great lengths to cover their tracks so far. Despite going as far as hacking the mall's security system so that they could obscure whoever had planted the shrunken gas canisters throughout the main hall in the first place, as well as watch their own sick handiwork unfold in real time, every attempt to trace the signal back to its source proved utterly futile. As he was reminded that the villain in charge must have been in the front row when the mall went into disarray and of his own actions as all might to stop it, Toshinori shuddered a little. The hero had narrowly avoided having his powering down captured on camera, thanks to the barrage of active quirks that were being thrown around that had compromised several of the nearby security cameras and the thick gas that obscured him from the farther ones. This was confirmed when his friends and the authorities went in to keep damage control. After realizing the situation, most of them felt a chill go down their spines because a villain had almost gotten the top hero's greatest weakness for free. As dreadful as this all is, said Toshinori, hopefully IDing these victims might give us something regarding the villain's motif and identity so we can at least prevent them from creating any more victims. The detective said, yes, I agree, and nodded. But truth be told, among the bodies that have so far been identified, there was another disturbing discovery that I felt I should alert you of. He rummaged through the folder, then took out another picture and set it on the desk. This time, it was of a young man in hospital scrubs. This person has been ID'd as a medical assistant working at the local hospital who was reported missing not too long ago by his co-workers. However, the timeframes don't add up. You see, according to our examinations of his body, the man must have died months ago, long before he even went missing in the first place. What? Are you absolutely certain there hasn't been some sort of mistake? Positive. We've even called in several forensic specialists with quirks that allows them to roughly verify our findings, and they've all backed up our initial results. And yet, both witness accounts and surveillance tapes confirm the man's continued presence at the hospital up until just a few weeks ago. Toshinori added, but doesn't make sense, as he looked more closely at the picture and file. How does someone continue to show up for work like normal for several months after their own murder? At this point, your guess is as good as mine. However, I felt I should warn you of this specifically, because during this time frame, the man was assigned with assisting the doctors overseeing the boy who helped you during the quirk Berserker incident while he was kept under observation at the hospital. The timing of his disappearance coincides with the boy's transfer into UA's care as well. Looking back up at his friend, Toshinori's eyes widened in surprise. You think the villain might be targeting young Midoriya? There was a flat line in Detective Tsukachi's mouth. Considering the overall role the boy played in this whole case, I think we should assume that they have their eye on him at the very least. And if this villain is anything like the deranged scientist the complexity of the quirk Berserker gas and our findings seem to suggest, he said, tapping the file cabinet that held the pictures, then I wouldn't be surprised if they're interested in finding out if and how their gas played a part in Midoriya-kun's subsequent mutation as well. They decided to notify the UA at the end of the meeting. Principal of these discoveries and their worries, permitting the little man animal to implement any suitable security measures he deemed necessary for the benefit of Midoriya and the pupils at the school. Speaking of which, the top hero chose to take out his cell phone and send the boy in question a brief text message as Toshinori marched out of the police station once more in the majestic guise of All Might, in nodding or waving at the amazed or smiling onlookers along the way. Hello, my boy, Midoriya. How are you? As he walked, he began typing. Principal Nedzu has informed me that your training and studies are progressing nicely. Or, more accurately, that they are doing so now, at least, because I've heard that there were some early snags. I'm sorry for not being able to pay you a visit in person lately. I'll make an effort to fix that soon. A.M. The bulky man pushed send as he left the building after reading his message again and deciding it was satisfactory. He then made to pocket the phone as he began to descend the stairs in front of the entrance. However, the cell phone buzzed in his hand before he could even release the device, so he pulled it up again. Holy moly, that was quick! The hero exclaimed, shocked to learn that the boy had already given him a suitable response. Also, it's damn long to boot. All Might. T, I appreciate your text message. The hero was once again astounded to discover that the boy's nervous stutter even permeated his text writing. It's been a little while, it said. I watched your video of defeating the villain, Big Wheel, who was tearing through the streets the other day in that large. His wheel contraption. It was really fantastic. T, the takedown and not the villain, exactly. As for me, I'm doing fairly well right now. For a while, I had some persistent issues with my spider sense, but after Mr. and I've been feeling much better ever since Mrs. Professor Hidokage changed my medication to my current prescription. I assume you've heard about it already, but I was reprimanded by the professors and Dr. Shuazenji, who became extremely irate, for trying to hide some of the headaches my quirk was still giving me and for straying a little from the training schedule they had created by working a little too hard in my free time without getting enough sleep and other things. I'm really sorry, and I didn't mean to cause any trouble, but when I think about the entrance exam that's coming up in a few months, I just feel like I might as well give it everything I've got if I want to pass. In order to live up to your expectations and give you all back for everything you've done for me, I want to become a true hero as soon as possible. The updated message read, also, there is absolutely no need for you to apologize. Since you're the #1 hero, I can certainly appreciate how busy you must be with work and other obligations every day. On the other hand, if you ever have the chance to come, would you be interested in joining us for dinner? There would likely need to be some planning involved, given my mom and other factors, so I know it might be a lot to ask given how little time you have these days, but perhaps you could at least consider it. The P professors would probably like to join us as well. They're actually having dinner with us today, you see, and I just thought it might be a little nice. I know you don't have much of an appetite and all, but I still thought it might be a little nice. Yes. Izuku. All Might snorted kindly as he started to respond to this monstrous text message, recognizing the boy's attempt to be tactful about the time limit of his muscle form and his stomach injury. I should have assumed that you would have kept yourself informed about my latest activities, including my fight from the other day. The hero snorted and wrote, it may be disheartening to admit, but that guy doesn't even rank in my top 10 of the weirder villains I've faced throughout my career. However, I have been told that you have been exerting yourself and even going so far as to train covertly on your own, staying up late, until you passed out during one of your classes. My boy, that's not good. Your teachers have probably already told you this, but you must follow the training schedule they have created for you because they have a purpose for setting it up that way, including the rest periods. Your teachers are also your doctors, and they have created a training plan for you specifically with your health and limitations in mind. I can understand your anxiety about making enough progress in time for the entrance exam and everything, but you must realize that pushing yourself too far will only backfire and hurt your chances. Although your sentiment is admirable, you should prioritize your own needs for the time being and try not to worry your mother too much. All Might paused his typing and looked straight ahead in contemplation for a moment before going back and deleting a portion of the text to write, as for your generous invitation, I'm flattered, my boy, but I'll give it some thought. With a tired but witty sigh, the hero glanced at his phone and pressed send again. As Midoriya Inko bid her son farewell for the evening, she said, take care now, sweetie, and he took care not to give her a strong hug in return, lest his now improved and still increasing strength cause her any harm. Really, since he'd woken up in the hospital, he'd already forgotten how many taps and door handles he'd unintentionally damaged. Izuku softly begged, Mom, take it easy, all too conscious of the female professor who was waiting in the doorway, grinning at their exhibit. We'll be seeing each other tomorrow evening, right? You don't have to be like this every night. She lifted a hand to caress his cheek as she reluctantly pulled him out of her arms. With a sad yet affectionate smile, she sniffed, oh, I know, honey. It's just, even though I know you're now awake from your coma and doing well, it still feels so terribly lonely to have to return to an empty house every night, that's all. Izuku muttered, Mom, as his heart ached a little for his mother, who must have been going through a lot every day for the past few months. Their almost tearful exchange came to an end when a big, soft hand touched Inko's shoulder. Professor Salamander assured the smaller woman, do not worry, Midoriya-san, while smiling sympathetically. If everything goes well, then you and your son should soon be able to live together like a proper family again. Inko blinked up at her over her shoulder, why yes, before she spun around and grabbed the big gloved hand in both of her own. But until then, Hidokage-san, please continue to watch over my son the way you have, alright? The smaller woman's abrupt and unreserved grasp around her hand knocked the dumbfounded salamander woman a little off balance, but she was able to respond to the earnest mother's pleading gaze with a comforting smile. she said, but of course, Midoriya-san, slowly resting her free hand on top of Inko's. You have my word. This time, Izuku, who was watching from the sidelines, grinned at the exchanges between the other two. The two women eventually left his room and went down the hallway after his mother gave him another farewell hug and the professor assured him that she and her husband would be right downstairs if he needed them, as usual. As they left, Inko remarked, "It was a shame your husband couldn't stay any longer after dinner." "Ah, yes. I'm afraid my husband is just very busy these days." "Oh, goodness. I hope looking after my son doesn't interfere too much with his work then." "Don't worry about it, Midoriya-san." She was reassured by Professor Salamander. "You know, since it's gotten dark out, would you like me to personally escort you to the school gates?" Yes, thank you. It's a bit of a walk across campus, after all, so that would be lovely." A grinning Izuku eventually shut the door properly and returned to his makeshift dorm, their voices trailing off as the two women vanished down a staircase. His living space was a large, repurposed break room that already had a small kitchen area, a TV nook with a couch and table, and a door leading to a bathroom with a shower. But the Hidokages were using proper guest rooms inside the school laboratory building while they were staying with him on campus. Izuku went to the coach, where he sat down and unmuted the small TV set in front of him before continuing with his activities from the majority of that evening. He passed the kitchen bench where the cleaned pots and pans were currently drying off by the sink. After dinner, the professor and his mother engaged in friendly conversation, which, much to Izuku's dismay, had mostly been about him. However, he had concentrated on a new little training exercise that the professors had created for him following the incident during this morning's training session. It involved training the spinnerets in his wrists by using his other hand to pull out and wind up the threads like a ball of yarn while continuously attempting to create webs that were thicker and more durable. He produced a certain amount, then held up the new web ball and studied the quality of the threads that made it for a few seconds before setting it down next to a pair of dumbbells on the couch table where several others from earlier that evening were already sitting. Instead, he picked up his cell phone. His giddy smile gradually faded as he reviewed a specific section of the conversation, specifically the entire fiasco surrounding his departure from his teacher's training plan and the reasons behind it. He was peeking out to himself about the text exchange he had shared with All Might earlier that day. Izuku was worried about making enough progress in time for the exams, but he didn't mention that one of the reasons was that the Hidokage couple's husband seemed contemptuous, if not outright opposed to the idea of him applying for the entrance exam the following semester. This made Izuku push himself more than he should have in an attempt to persuade the lizard man to change his mind. Izuku realized he no longer felt quite as put out or high-strung in the man's company, even though the boy had been properly reassured that the professor's cold attitude toward him was not out of contempt for him and his dream to become a hero, something he'd tragically experienced far too much of throughout his life, but rather out of a reserved concern for his safety and health. But this realization had, if anything, increased his desire to prove himself and gain the man's approval. Izuku stood up again and walked to the back of the break room, where he was given a bed and a desk for the duration of his stay. There, he took out a familiar, burnt notebook from the stack of schoolbooks against the wall. Along with picking up a mechanical pencil, he made a tiny, skillful leap through the air and sat on his haunches halfway up a wall, keeping his feet beneath him to keep him anchored on the vertical surface while his back was flat against the wall. He was developing the unintentional habit of clinging to different surfaces while he reviewed his schoolwork or just lazed around in his room, which was already beginning to become second nature, as he had long since arrived at the point where he had been granted permission to freely train this aspect of his quirk, as long as it was done in moderation and in safe environments. Before he reached the doodles and drawings he'd since added to the later pages, he leaned the notebook against his knees and smiled as he flipped through the many hero autographs. Among these was another illustration of All Might, which he had become very skilled at over the years. However, he was well aware of how extremely dangerous it was to reveal the top hero's secrets on paper anywhere and had prudently refrained from doing so, even though he had really wanted to write down the new information he had discovered about his favorite hero in these pages, if only to organize and catalog his own thoughts about them in the process. He turned the pages further and skipped over the several pages he devoted to comparing and contrasting his own quirk and that of the quirk spider until he found some cruder drawings of his two new teachers, along with notes he'd made about the similarities and differences between their mutant-type traits and skills. Then he clicked his mechanical pencil and changed the title of these pages from Professors Mr. and Mrs. Hidokage to their hero names, Professor Lizard and Professor Fire Salamander, since the latter had brooked no argument over dinner about how he should be addressing the pair from now on, no matter how irritated her husband protested at the time. Izuku sat up on the wall. The TV said buzzing softly in the background, and after the changes were finished, he turned the page over and began to slowly elaborate on his notes about them. During Izuku's time at UA, we went on to show a man dressed as a campus security guard standing in front of a wardrobe mirror one morning in a small apartment in the city, apparently getting ready for the day. The man finished tying his tie and then retrieved his cell phone from his pocket as it began to ring. "Yes, hello?" The person on the phone told him. "Hey, I'm right outside waiting with the car," with a slightly impatient tone. "Hurry up and get down here already, so we can get going to UA before the morning rush hits." The man calmly replied, "My apologies, senpai. I overslept a little," with a smile. "I'll be right down in just a moment." "You'd better be, or we might end up late for our shift because of you." The two then stopped talking, leaving the man in the apartment to put on his jacket and put his phone away. However, he leaned into the open wardrobe before departing, where the unconscious body of a man who was exactly the same as him was sitting hunched over at the bottom. Or worse, maybe. The guard slid the wardrobe door shut and left the apartment, tying the ID badge on himself as he helped himself to the badge that was clipped onto the still man's shirt. He adjusted his tie one last time for good measure and locked the apartment door behind him. "Now then," he said with a smile. "Time to get to work."
So this was it for the series. I hope you enjoyed it. To watch more series like this, subscribe to my channel. Till then, bye bye.